Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into the ancient world's weirdest and most unbelievable sex laws. Like laws that make you squint and go, wait, there was they legalised that. Or, seriously, that got you executed? You're about to tiptoe through dusty temples, royal bedrooms, and courtroom scrolls where intimacy wasn't just personal, it was a matter of state. And heads up, you probably won't survive this if you're expecting something normal. Ancient civilizations were anything but chill about what went on behind closed doors. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I post these bizarre bedtime journeys a few times a week, and I love hearing where you're watching from. Drop your city and current time down below. I want to know who's up late with me tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're starting in the sun-baked lands of ancient Mesopotamia, where law wasn't just etched into bone and stone, it was baked into clay. You know the Code of Hammurabi, right? That 18th century BC Babylonian legal code carved into a giant black stone pillar? It's one of the earliest legal texts we have, and it is not shy when it comes to what you can and cannot do with your body, or someone else's. It's not exactly light reading. Picture it, a giant stone column looming in a temple courtyard, listing out nearly 300 rules on everything from stolen goats to, sexual conduct. Now, Babylon didn't really believe in privacy. Marriages were legal contracts, not love stories. If you were a woman caught cheating, the punishment was often death by drowning in the river. If you were a man caught sleeping with a married woman, you might be off the hook, unless her husband complained. So yes, the law was very chill, if you were the husband. But here's the kicker. Babylonian law even laid out what to do in cases of suspected adultery. If a man merely thought his wife was being unfaithful, she had to undergo a trial by ordeal, usually by throwing herself into the river. If she survived, innocent. If she drowned, oops, guilty, I guess. Nothing says justice like a good old test of whether you can swim in full ceremonial robes. And before you think men got off easy every time, think again. If a man raped someone else's wife and it wasn't consensual, then he got executed, though the woman might be punished too, depending on the judge. Babylon had this odd way of dragging everyone down with the ship, literally, in some cases. But one of the stranger laws is this. If a man caught his wife with another man and killed them both on the spot, he was totally in the clear, just not guilty. Vigilante justice, legally encouraged. Yet if he let them live, the court got involved and things got messy. Morally, you were supposed to be enraged, but not too chill about it either. There was a perfect level of fury expected, like righteous with a hint of homicidal. Now, here's a quirky little fringe detail they don't usually tell you in school. Babylonian prostitutes, who are actually registered with the temple, had their own tax codes. That's right. Sex work wasn't just legal, it was bureaucratically organised. The government took a cut. There are surviving receipts stamped with tiny cuneiform symbols that basically say, thanks for your service to the economy. And temple-based sex workers, often working in service of a deity like Ishtar, were considered sacred intermediaries between gods and mortals. Your average working girl might have divine endorsement and a monthly invoice. But here's where things get weirder. Scholars still debate the role of these so-called sacred prostitutes. Some say it's a myth cooked up by the early historians. Others swear the records are too detailed to be fiction. Either way, the existence of tax logs, temple registries and cuneiform carving showing erotic rites seems to point to something official going on, something that blurs the line between law, worship and sex in ways that make modern eyes widen. Now imagine yourself there in the middle of a bustling ziggurat courtyard. It's hot, the air smells like incense, goat sweat and whatever people used before soap was widely available. Around you merchants shout, priests chant, scribes scratch legal notes into clay. Maybe someone's about to toss their wife into the river. Maybe someone's paying their monthly sex work tax. This was daily life in Babylon, where sex wasn't sinful, it was strictly regulated, and everyone had an opinion. It's strange how the further back we go in history, the more casual some of these laws become about things we now consider taboo, and the more brutally serious they are about things we might brush off. Adultery could mean death, but selling your daughter into a temple sex position? Legal, endorsed, sometimes even honourable. That strange blend of logic and absurdity is the heartbeat of ancient legal systems. They weren't written for fairness, they were written for order, for clarity in a messy, dangerous world. and to the Babylonians, controlling sex meant controlling lineage, economy, and divine favour all at once. You weren't just sleeping with someone. You were either following the will of the gods or deeply offending them. No pressure. So next time you think modern laws are complicated, just be glad you don't have to pass a swim test to prove your innocence, or keep an itemised receipt after a visit to the temple. Let's stay in the region for a bit longer, because ancient Sumer, older than Babylon by centuries, might just take the cake for mixing sex, spirituality, and legal documentation into one steamy bureaucratic smoothie. Tonight we're heading back to about 2500 BCE, to the city of Uruk, where the goddess Inanna reigned supreme, and some very official forms of sacred sex were not only legal, they were expected. Like, imagine going to your local tax office, but instead of an audit, you're gently ushered into a velvet-draped chamber by someone wearing gold-threaded robes and a knowing smile. This wasn't underground stuff. This was temple-sanctioned ritual intimacy, and it had its own laws, its own ethics, and yeah, even a little paperwork. The practice is often referred to today as hieros gamos, or sacred marriage. In this ritual, a priest-king would symbolically mate with a high priestess of Inanna to ensure the land's fertility and the god's favour for the coming year. It wasn't just symbolic either. There were physical acts involved, believed to channel divine energy into the soil, the people, and the very city itself. It was religion, politics, and pleasure in one awkwardly candle-lit package. Now, this might sound like a royal free pass for fun, but the laws around it were very specific. Only certain priestesses, usually trained from childhood, could take on this role. They had to be ritually pure, which meant things like not menstruating during the ritual, fasting beforehand, and reciting hymns to Inanna that, frankly, read more like sultry love poems than sacred scripture. And the king? He didn't just show up in a toga with grapes. He had to bathe, wear ceremonial garments, and sometimes even ingest sacred intoxicants to enhance the union. Consent, oddly enough, was legally assumed, because the ritual wasn't about individual desire. It was about the cosmic balance between heaven and earth. But what really makes this fascinating is that Sumer had an entire class of people, male and female, dedicated to temple service through sexual acts. These weren't slaves, they were temple workers. Some scholars call them sacred prostitutes, but that term doesn't quite hit the mark. They were more like divine intermediaries. To sleep with one of them wasn't shameful, it was purifying. And yes, there were receipts. Clay tablets found in the ruins of Sumerian cities list payments, offerings, and even disputes over who got to access which temple workers on what day. So yes, scheduling intimacy with the divine required a literal sign-up sheet. Here's a fun little fringe fact for you. Some of these temple workers belonged to a third gender category. Not male, not female, somewhere in between. The Sumerians even had words for them, like gala and kogaru, and they played roles in both music and sex rites. Some were men who dressed and acted as women in service of the goddess, and their role was not mocked or marginalised. It was legally and spiritually respected, which, if you think about it, is centuries ahead of where a lot of the world is even today. But scholars argue about how widespread or voluntary these practices were. Some researchers believe that the idea of sacred prostitution has been wildly overstated, based on biased translations from the 19th century, when anything exotic and sexual was kind of fetishised by early archaeologists. Others point out that the sheer volume of inscriptions, receipts, and ritual hymns suggests something formal was going on. The truth probably sits in the middle. There was a religious role that involved intimacy, but maybe it wasn't as common or as romanticised as we imagine. Still, imagine walking past a temple in Uruk, incense curling into the night sky, hymns rising like mgorbehaut, and somewhere inside 2 people entwined in candlelight, watched by priestesses and scribes, participating in a state-sponsored moment of transcendence. And all of it recorded in neat lines of cuneiform, because yes, the Sumerians were a bit obsessed with writing everything down, even their cosmic hookups. The legal side gets even weirder when you realise how layered the sex laws were outside the temple too. For instance, marriages in Sumer were contracts, sealed with a dowry and usually arranged by the parents. And here's where it gets spicy. If a man accused his wife of being barren, he could legally take a second wife, but he had to keep supporting the first one. Divorce was allowed, but not very free. You'd still have to return her dowry or give her land rights, depending on who initiated the split. Also, if a man left his wife for more than a year without sending money or word, she could legally remarry. the law had a clock on ghosting. And as for sexual crimes, they took a dark turn. Rape was punishable, but only if the woman was married. If she wasn't, the lines got blurry fast. In some cases, the punishment was a fine paid to the father or brother, because women were legally considered property of their male relatives until married. Even more bizarre, if two people were caught having sex in a field and no one screamed, the court might rule it consensual. So the law required noise, like literal screaming, for proof of assault. Let that sink in. Yet in this mess of clay tablets and divine rituals, there's an undeniable sense of structure. The Sumerians didn't leave sex to chance. It was legislated, taxed, spiritualized, and controlled. Intimacy had rules, and breaking them wasn't just a moral failing, it was a cosmic one. The line between worship and desire was so thin, it might as well have been drawn in incense smoke. So next time you're scrolling through some dry legal document, just be glad it doesn't end with, "And then the accused shall lie with a priestess under the watchful gaze of the gods, and a goat shall be present for reasons we choose not to explain." Okay, now let's sail a little further down the Nile and step into the shimmering incense-heavy world of ancient Egypt, where sex wasn't just political, it was downright divine, especially if you happen to be wearing a crown. Pharaohs didn't just make the laws, they were the laws, the gods' physical embodiment on earth, which meant that what happened in their bedrooms wasn't just allowed, it was often expected. So tonight, we're talking about something that still turns stomachs and raises eyebrows. Royal incest. Yeah, that one. Buckle up. Ancient Egyptian royalty had a bit of an obsession with keeping things in the family. Not like distant cousin stuff either. We're talking full siblings, brother and sister marriages that were completely legal, widely practiced, and even celebrated with murals, hymns, and elaborate wedding rituals. And before you say ew, just know they would absolutely judge you for marrying outside the royal bloodline. In their view, the divine blood of the gods had to remain undiluted. Mixing it with commoner DNA? Total sacrilege. The famous example everyone throws around is Cleopatra, but she was just one of a long line of rulers, including the mighty Ramses II, Akhenaten, and even Tutankhamun, who married their sisters, or half-sisters, or nieces, sometimes all of the above. The laws allowed it, and more importantly religion encouraged it. Because in their mythology the gods themselves, like Isis and Osiris, were siblings and also husband and wife. So by mimicking the divine couple, the pharaoh was fulfilling a holy obligation. Like, what better way to prove your legitimacy than a deeply awkward family reunion wedding? Now here's where the law really kicks in. These marriages weren't private arrangements. They were legally recognised with contracts, titles, and often entire tomb inscriptions bragging about the union. Queens who were also sisters weren't just consorts, they were gods' wives of Amun, powerful religious figures in their own right. Their shared bloodline gave them automatic access to both political and spiritual power, and any child born of this union? Jackpot, double dose of divine DNA. But here's the fringe fact that slips through the cracks. Some of these royal pairings were never actually consummated, or at least that's what some historians argue. There's evidence, especially from the Amarna period, that some marriages were ceremonial only, more about status than, well, sibling romance. This has sparked massive debate in scholarly circles. Were they actually doing it, or just posing for the statues and inscription? The answer is still lost in the sand, but the legal framework definitely allowed it either way. No one was raising an eyebrow back then, except maybe the servants, quietly behind a pillar. And here's another layer. While royal incest was common in the palace, it was strictly illegal for commoners. In fact, ancient Egyptian legal codes, though less centralised than Babylon's, made clear distinctions about acceptable unions for non-royal citizens. Marriage between siblings among farmers or merchants, absolute scandal. But for the divine elite, totally fine. In fact, required. So the same act that would get you disowned in one part of Egypt might win you a gold amulet and a tomb painting in another. Now imagine this, you're in Thebes. The sun is baking the city's limestone walls. A procession winds through the streets toward Karnak Temple. At the centre are two glittering figures, both wearing serpent crowns, both decked in linen and lapis lazuli. They're brother and sister, yes, but also newlyweds. Priests chant, lotus petals are tossed, and scribes record every moment onto papyrus scrolls that will sit in dusty archives for millennia. Somewhere nearby a scribe murmurs, "Well, at least the paperwork's easy, same last name." And while we're at it, let's talk inheritance. The incestuous unions weren't just symbolic. They had cold, hard, legal logic behind them. Egypt didn't have a clear rule about primogeniture like later European monarchies. Instead, the throne often passed to whoever had the strongest blood claim, which usually meant through the mother. Marrying your sister, who was also royal, ensured your children had undisputed legitimacy. You couldn't just marry a pretty noblewoman and expect the gods to approve. No. She had to be your equal, your sister, maybe your older sister even, because power sometimes ran uphill. That being said, not every pharaoh got away with it scot-free. One of the juiciest scholarly debates surrounds the infamous Akhenaten, who some believe may have married not only his sister, but possibly one of his daughters later in life. There's a mysterious woman named Kia who shows up in inscriptions, and some scholars think she was his daughter-wife. Others argue that's complete nonsense, and Kia was just a minor wife with no royal blood. We don't have definitive proof either way, just cryptic inscriptions and half-erased wall carvings that suggest something uncomfortable was going on. So while the law allowed these unions, the ethics and logistics probably got complicated, even back then. Imagine trying to run a kingdom, maintain divine favour, and also have family dinners where your wife is also your sister and your mum is also your aunt. It's like a living Venn diagram of discomfort. But again, context matters. These laws made perfect sense to the people who lived under them. In a culture where the pharaoh was the literal son of Ra, sleeping with your sister wasn't scandalous. It was sacred duty. Morality, law and religion weren't separate realms. They were all part of the same swirling Nile current that shaped every detail of life and death. So next time someone brings up keeping it in the family, just be grateful you weren't born into the House of Ramses, where your wedding guest list was also your family reunion and your political strategy involved some deeply confusing genealogy charts. So we've established that ancient Egypt had some, let's say, flexible ideas about marriage. But what happened when things went wrong in the land of pyramids and papyrus scrolls? Tonight we're drifting away from royal incest and stepping into the shadowy, drama-filled world of adultery in ancient Egypt. A world where cheating wasn't just a moral misstep. It was a criminal offence with punishments so intense they'd make modern reality TV divorces look like therapy sessions. First things first, adultery in ancient Egypt wasn't an equal opportunity crime. Like many ancient laws, it was heavily gendered. If a married woman cheated, it was considered a severe betrayal of not just her husband, but also the entire cosmic balance. No pressure. But if a married man had sex with an unmarried woman, shrug, just a Tuesday. As long as she wasn't married or a noble or a temple virgin, he could probably walk away with nothing more than a stern side-eye from the neighbours. But when a woman strayed, that's when the courtroom drama began, and it got vicious fast. Legal records, tomb inscription, and scattered temple decrees all suggest that the punishment for female adultery could range from divorce and public shaming to exile, mutilation, or in extreme cases, death. One ancient court scroll refers to a woman who was burned alive for spoiling the name of her household. Another account describes a woman being beaten and shaved, her head publicly displayed as a warning. Because yes, in a world where status and lineage were everything, breaking the fidelity contract was like lighting a match in a grain store. And don't assume the husband needed proof. Rumour was enough to spark an investigation. In some cases, even dreams were considered suspicious evidence. If a man had a dream that his wife was cheating, he could present that to a priest or scribe, who would begin a formal inquiry. And you better believe they took dreams seriously. These were people who interpreted everything from animal entrails to the angle of the moonlight on your pillow. Still, not every case ended in flames. Sometimes it played out more like a grim divorce court. If a woman was found guilty of adultery, she could be stripped of her dowry, her children, and her social standing. Some laws required her to leave the marital home immediately, taking only what she was wearing. Others allowed her husband to keep her under house arrest. And yes, that was a real thing. They had a word for it that roughly translates to locked one. Think Rapunzel, but with more linen and fewer hair-based escape plans. Here's a wild little twist, though. Despite all the strict laws, ancient Egyptians were wildly romantic. They left behind poetry that would make a Hallmark card blush. Love letters, flirtatious inscriptions, Even carved-in stone declarations of heartbreak have been found buried in tombs and temples. And guess what? Some of these suggest affairs did happen. Often. The papyri hint at secret trysts, love-struck scribes, and longing glances from across the fields. So while the laws were strict, human whole nature was, well, still human. And here's your quirky fringe detail. Some scholars believe that certain fertility rituals encouraged extramarital intimacy. Yes, you heard that right. There were ceremonial festivals, like the Feast of the Drunkenness, held in honour of Hathor, where heavy drinking, wild dancing, and questionable decision-making were basically part of the religious experience. At these events, sexual freedom wasn't just allowed, it was celebrated as a way to honour the gods of fertility and pleasure. So you could say there were legal exceptions to the fidelity rule, if you timed your infidelity just right. Of course, not everyone agrees on how widespread these practices were. Egyptologists still debate whether these festivals were genuinely law-free zones or just symbolic rituals blown out of proportion by later historians. Some argue that the state turned a blind eye during those events, while others believe the stories of temple orgies are mostly exaggerated. Either way, the legal system bounced between strict control and strange loopholes, depending on whether the gods were watching or partying. Now, let's take a walk through an upper-class household in Thebes. You step into the courtyard, date palms swaying, a servant pouring wine, the scent of honey and crushed herbs drifting through the air. The lady of the house is reclining on a cushioned bench, a cat at her feet. But something's off. Her husband is missing. Whispers ripple through the household staff. The neighbour saw a scribe leave the back gate late last night. A servant girl swears she heard laughter behind the papyrus screen. By morning, a priest has been summoned. The wife stands before a small tribunal in the home's shrine room. Yes, private justice was often handled at home if you were wealthy enough. The priest holds up a strip of linen, says a prayer to Ma'at, and tosses it into a bowl of water. If it floats, she's innocent. If it sinks, well, it was nice knowing you. And yes, that was a real ordeal, one of many superstitious tests to determine guilt. Others involved sacred oaths, or meditating in isolation until the gods gave a sign. The Egyptians didn't always rely on physical evidence. They relied on omens, symbols, and the occasional talking goose. No joke, one story involves a goose revealing a lover's identity by biting him. Crime-fighting, poultry, go figure. Meanwhile, if the husband was caught cheating, he might have to pay a small fine, apologise publicly, or maybe do a purification ritual at the temple. But death, mutilation, dream interrogation, not likely. That double standard was baked into every layer of society. Men had freedom, women had surveillance. And yet, despite all this, Egyptian society wasn't entirely cruel about love. Some laws protected widows, ensured inheritance rights for children of divorce, and even gave women the power to write their own marriage contracts with clauses like, "He may not take another wife unless I agree." So within the legal storm, there were small islands of agency, brief moments where the rules bent and love wasn't entirely caged. So if you're keeping track, in ancient Egypt, if your spouse had a wandering eye, they might end up shaved, exiled, burned, or bitten by a goose. The gods worked in mysterious ways. And the law? Even more so. Now let's hop across the Mediterranean and into the dust and sweat of ancient Sparta, where things get aggressively weird, but in a very disciplined, state-sanctioned kind of way. You've probably heard about their military obsession, their six-pack abs, their whole raise tough kids or toss them off a cliff vibe. But what most people don't know is that Spartans had some of the most unexpected sex laws in the ancient world. And tonight we're unpacking the bizarre legal practice of wife-sharing. Yes, literally lending your wife to another man for the good of the state. No, it wasn't an orgy. This wasn't Athens. This was Sparta. And Sparta did everything with grit, grunting, and a stern nod of approval from the Council of Elders. So here's the setup. The entire Spartan legal and cultural system was built around producing strong, loyal, obedient warriors. Marriage was part of that, but love, passion, nah, those were distractions. A Spartan marriage wasn't about candlelight dinners. It was more like a government-mandated breeding program. Get in, make strong babies, get out and get back to the gym. And since only a small portion of the male population was full-fledged Spartan, the Spartiates, the city-state was constantly worried about its population declining. Fewer warriors meant fewer victories. Enter the totally legal, deeply confusing custom of procreative borrowing. Let's say you're an older man, maybe a war hero or someone of high status, but you're past your child-making prime. No problem. You can legally invite a younger, stronger Spartan man to sleep with your wife and hopefully give you a son. And here's the kicker. No shame, no secrets, no drama. In fact, it was expected that this would happen if it served the military cause. And this wasn't just an informal arrangement whispered in the agora. Spartan law, backed by oral tradition and enforced by the ephors, the 5 most powerful magistrates in the city, recognised these eugenic couplings as legitimate. Children born from them were fully legal Spartan citizens, as long as the husband approved. Think of it as state-sponsored surrogacy, but with way more leather sandals and way fewer feelings. But what's even stranger? Sometimes the opposite happened. A single Spartan man could be granted temporary access to another man's wife to help her conceive, even if he had no intention of marrying her. These agreements were usually negotiated between the men, and again, no one thought it was scandalous. It was like swapping gym partners, except way more intense. And if a woman had proven herself capable of bearing strong sons, she could even have multiple assigned partners for the sake of strengthening the next generation. No official seals or ceremonies, no flowers, just glory to Sparta and pass the olive oil. And yes, the women had a say, sort of. Spartan women had more legal rights than most women in the ancient world. They could own land, inherit wealth, and were educated to read, write, and manage their households. But when it came to sex laws, their choices were framed by what was best for the city. Personal preference was often outweighed by procreative strategy. Now here's a quirky lesser-known fact. Newlywed Spartan women often had to disguise themselves as men on their wedding night. Yep, they'd cut their hair short, wear men's clothing, and wait in a darkened room for their husband to sneak in, do the deed, and slip back out before dawn. Why? Scholars still debate this. Some say it was to ease the transition for young men who'd been raised entirely in all-male military barracks, and were probably more emotionally, and maybe physically, bonded with their fellow soldiers than with women. Others argue it was just a symbolic gesture to masculinize the act of creating warriors. Either way, it's a ritual that sounds suspiciously like the opening scene of a very niche indie film. The real scholarly debate, though, is over how widespread and formalised these lending practices were. Some historians argue that these stories come mostly from later Greek writers like Plutarch, who romanticised or exaggerated Spartan customs to make them seem more intense or noble. Others think the archaeological and literary evidence, combined with how few full-blooded Spartans there actually were by the end of their era, supports the idea that this wasn't just a quirky exception, but a critical part of Spartan survival. And speaking of scarcity, it's estimated that by the time of the Peloponnesian War, there were fewer than 1,000 full Spartan citizens left. Which means wife-sharing wasn't just allowed, it was practically a civic duty. If you didn't have kids, the entire political system teetered. So lending your wife to a younger man wasn't seen as emasculating, it was a sacrifice for the good of Sparta, like paying taxes, but way more awkward. Now close your eyes for a second and imagine it. A quiet stone courtyard in Sparta, the air filled with the scent of burning sage and goat sweat. 2 men in red cloaks shake hands under the eyes of a stern magistrate. One says, "She's ovulating." The other nods. No drama, no jealousy, just civic responsibility and maybe a light protein snack afterward. The woman watches from her doorway, arms crossed, probably thinking just another Tuesday. Meanwhile, across town, another newlywed is being hurried into a torchlit room, her long hair lopped off, a man's cloak thrown over her shoulders. She sits on a low bench, silent, waiting for a husband who might be more comfortable wrestling his bunkmate than consummating their government-assigned union. It's weird. It's clinical. It's Sparta. So while Athens wrote poetry and held drunken debates about love and philosophy, Sparta regulated sex like a military manoeuvre. Efficient, strategic, slightly terrifying. There were no romantic strolls or flirtatious odes, just the constant drumbeat of duty, discipline, and DNA optimization. Next time you hear someone say, Spartans were tough, just remember they were also terrifyingly organised about who got to sleep with whose wife. And if you think modern dating is complicated, try explaining to your spouse that it's your legal responsibility to loan them out to your buff neighbour for the glory of your country. Now let's wander across the mountains and into Athens, the brainy, dramatic cousin to muscular, no-nonsense Sparta. Athens, land of Socrates and sculpture, of democracy and dithyrambs, had an entirely different relationship with law, sex, and social order. And tonight, We're peeling back the marble curtain to look at one of the most lopsided legal realities in ancient Greece, the glaring double standard in Athenian sex laws. Because if you were a man, the world was basically your symposium. But if you were a woman, let's just say you weren't invited to the party. Literally. Let's set the stage. Athens in the 5th century BCE was the cradle of philosophy, debate and civic participation, as long as you were a free-born male citizen. Everyone else, Eve's foreigners and yes, women, existed in a kind of legal half-shadow. And when it came to sex, the shadows got even darker. The Athenian legal system gave men enormous freedom. Married? Not a problem. You could still sleep with prostitutes, concubines, and even cabills so long as the arrangement followed the law. Meanwhile, your wife was expected to stay indoors, raise the children, weave some wool, and never, never be seen at a dinner party. Here's how the categories broke down. Athenians divided women into 3 legal types: wives, concubines, and hetairae. Wives were for bearing legitimate children and managing the household. Concubines were for daily pleasure, often long-term companions without legal recognition. And hetairae? They were the high-class courtesans, educated, witty and legally protected, able to own property, converse with men in public, and attend symposia, those famous male drinking parties where people debated philosophy while getting progressively wine drunk. A hetaira could flirt with Plato and recite Sappho, all in the same evening. Your wife? Not even allowed to sit in the next room. Now here's the thing, these distinctions weren't just social, they were enshrined in law. An Athenian citizen could not legally marry a foreign woman or prostitute. His children by those unions wouldn't inherit citizenship. But he could still sleep with them. Often, legally, and without shame. Women, however, had exactly one legal sexual partner, their husband. Any deviation from that? Massive consequences. A married woman caught in adultery could be divorced on the spot, banned from public religious rites, and if the husband wanted to go full vigilante, her lover could be killed without trial. And this wasn't a legal loophole, it was built into the system. The law explicitly allowed a husband to murder a man caught in bed with his wife. No fine, no exile, just go ahead, sir. Meanwhile, the man might have had several mistresses, a slave girl on the side, and maybe a thing for his young apprentice. All legal, all cool, just don't touch his wife. One especially juicy trial, recorded by the orator Lysias, involved a man named Euphalitos, who caught his wife's lover, Eratosthenes, in the act and straight up murdered him. In court, he gave a speech calmly explaining how he waited until they were in the act, then stabbed him with a sword. The jury applauded. He was acquitted, because you know honour. Meanwhile, a woman accused of adultery might be put through a public shaming ritual, stripped of jewellery, banned from sacred ceremonies and labelled moichos, or adulteress. And here's the legal cherry on top. Boy. Even if she wasn't guilty, the mere accusation could ruin her. She had no voice in court, no legal autonomy, and couldn't testify on her own behalf. A male guardian had to represent her. So if her husband wanted to lie about her for, say, political reasons or personal spite, congratulations, you've just been legally ghosted in 400 BCE. But here's a quirky little fact that adds even more twist to this already knotted rope. Some Athenian men wrote love letters to boys. Yeah, that's not even a euphemism. Pederasty, the romantic and often sexual mentorship between older men and adolescent boys, was not just tolerated, it was idealised. There were rules about it, of course. The boy had to be at least 12, the relationship had to be non-coercive, and ideally it involved some level of intellectual mentorship. But it was so ingrained in the culture that it was carved into pottery. Literally. We have vases where one man chases another around with an erection, and somehow this was considered educational. And again, this wasn't a secret, it was out in the open, and the law didn't object as long as everyone followed the protocol. Meanwhile, women, forbidden to even show their face at a dinner party. It was the ancient equivalent of putting your wife in the kitchen and your boyfriend on the guest list. So scholars today ask, how did women feel about this? Were they bitter? Secretly subversive? Was there an underground sisterhood of resentful wives brewing silent revolution over their looms? We don't really know, because women's voices were almost entirely erased from the legal and literary records. What we do know is that some elite women did manage to bend the rules, like Aspasia, the lover of Pericles, who was a hetaira and philosopher rumoured to have influenced political speechwriting. But Aspasia wasn't typical. She was exceptional, and even she was relentlessly attacked in comedy plays for daring to exist outside the mould. Still, the lines were occasionally blurred. Sometimes wives would pose as heterae to get access to events or influence politics from the sidelines. There's even some evidence that elite women occasionally used male disguises to sneak into symposiums. One fragment from Aristophanes references women among us with painted beards. Was it satire? Probably. Was it based on reality? Possibly. The urge to break unfair laws is as old as the laws themselves. So here you are, a man in Athens. You can flirt with a hetaira, sleep with your slave, court a teenage boy, kill your wife's lover, and still hold a seat on the city council. But if you're a woman, your only path is through the front door of your house, and you'd better not step out unless it's to attend a funeral or deliver bread, or both. Next time someone romanticizes Athenian democracy, remember it was built by and for about 10% of the population. The rest, silence, shadow, and laws that read like a particularly bleak episode of a soap opera. Equal rights wouldn't show up for, oh, another couple thousand years, give or take. Let's keep following the philosophical wine trail into Rome, where the toga was always freshly laundered, the forums echoed with political and political scheming, and behind every marble column was someone breaking a law they helped write. Rome took all the social flexibility of Athens and turned it into a legal circus, complete with public shaming, civil penalties and sex laws so tangled even Julius Caesar needed a PR team. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of Roman bedchambers and Senate rules, where who you slept with could make or break your entire political career, and sometimes your head. In theory, Rome was a republic built on structure, honour and discipline. In practice, it was a mess of contradictions. The legal code, starting with the 12 tables and evolving over centuries, laid out expectations for marital fidelity, chastity and family virtue, especially among the elite. But Roman elites were also some of the most creatively unfaithful people in ancient history. It wasn't even a secret. It was more like a competitive sport. Let's start with marriage. For a Roman citizen, particularly a man of the senatorial class, marriage was as much a political alliance as it was a legal status. You didn't marry for love, you married to consolidate land, secure military ties, or impress someone's father-in-law. But even within these high-stakes arrangements, the expectations were vastly uneven. A husband could visit prostitutes, keep concubines, and carry on affairs with slaves, all perfectly legal. A wife, however, had exactly one acceptable partner. Stray from him, and the law came knocking. Enter the infamous Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendis, or the Julian law on adultery, passed by Augustus around 18 BCE. Now, Augustus didn't just want to reform Rome's government, he wanted to reform its bedrooms. He declared adultery a public crime, not just a family matter, a state issue. Suddenly sleeping with someone else's wife could land you in court, your property seized, your reputation shredded, and for women, oh, it got even grimmer. If a woman was convicted of adultery, her husband was legally required to divorce her, and she could be exiled to a remote island. Pack your toga and say goodbye to Rome. And if the husband didn't press charges, he could be prosecuted himself for harbouring a criminal. The state now had the right to intervene in your marriage. It was like Big Brother, but in sandals. But here's the deeply Roman twist. While Augustus was writing morality laws, his own family was knee-deep in scandal. His daughter Julia, beautiful, clever, and absolutely uninterested in the quiet domestic life, became the symbol of his reforms gone sideways. She took lovers, many lovers, in public sometimes. She was everything the Lex Julia was meant to punish, and eventually it did. Augustus exiled his own daughter to a barren island, forbade her from drinking wine or receiving visitors, and never spoke to her again. Rome applauded, then went back to cheating on their spouses like nothing happened. Meanwhile, Roman men were navigating their own legal minefields. You could be a senator, a war hero, a poor hero, and a patron of the arts. But if you were accused of being passive in a same-sex relationship, your enemies could use it against you in court. Masculinity was policed, not based on orientation, but position. A free-born Roman man could sleep with men as long as he was the dominant partner, and the other man was either a slave, a prostitute, or a foreigner. But if he took the submissive role, boom, public disgrace. Your opponents might carve it into graffiti outside the Senate, and yes, they did that. And this wasn't just dirty politics, it was legally actionable. An enemy could bring a Lex Scatinia case against you, one of the few laws that criminalise male-male sex under certain conditions. And the punishment? Sometimes fines, sometimes exile, always humiliation. So picture this, a guy in a spotless white toga giving a stirring speech about preserving Roman virtue, while secretly bribing scribes to erase bathhouse records with his name on them. Here's a fringe fact that's just too juicy to leave out. Some Roman emperors, like Elagabalus, said screw it to the double standards. Elagabalus reportedly married a male slave, wore women's makeup and offered vast sums of money to any physician who could surgically give him female anatomy. The Senate hated him, the public was scandalised, and eventually the Praetorian Guard killed him and dumped his body in the Tiber. That's the Roman way of cancelling someone. But not all sex laws were about scandal, some were about taxes. The Emperor Caligula, in his brief chaotic rule, introduced a prostitution tax, essentially legalising brothels while turning them into a state revenue stream. Not to be outdone, Nero allegedly opened his own imperial brothel in the palace, just to see if he could. The law never quite caught up with the emperors, who operated in a realm of divine exemption. But regular citizens, they had to watch their backs and their beds. Now close your eyes and imagine walking through the Forum, sunlight glinting off marble columns, senators whispering in cloaks, and somewhere nearby a young scribe hurrying through the crowd, holding a scroll marked Lex Julia Complaint Number 542. Inside a quiet domus, a noble woman sits stone-faced, her husband and accuser pacing, her lover already in chains. A magistrate listens. If he's in a bad mood, it's exile. If he's in a really bad mood, public flogging, loss of citizenship, property auctioned off, for everyone. And yet Romans never stopped pushing the limits. The laws were strict, but the people were relentless. Affairs happened in the baths, in the gardens, in secret rooms behind temples. Some lovers disguised themselves as slaves. Others wrote steamy poetry full of code words and references, just in case the wrong eyes were reading. Ovid, the great romantic poet, was exiled not for his writing, but for what Augustus called a mistake. No one ever found out what it was. Scholars still argue. Did he sleep with the wrong woman? Did he know too much about Julia? The point is, one misstep in love could cost you everything. So next time you see a statue of a stern-faced Roman orator, remember, that man may have had 3 mistresses, a concubine, a boyfriend, and a lawyer on retainer, just in case things got legally complicated. Rome was orderly on the outside, but underneath that marble surface, total chaos. Now let's descend into the chill of solemn silence and flickering torchlight, because tonight you're stepping into the eerie world of the Vestal Virgins, Rome's most sacred priestesses, the sworn protectors of the city's divine flame, and possibly the most legally fragile people in all of ancient history. You think your job has pressure? Try maintaining your virginity for 30 years under constant surveillance, with the full weight of the Roman legal system poised to bury you alive if you slip up. No, that's not a metaphor. They literally buried you, alive, in a sealed tomb, with a little bit of food. You know, so it didn't seem cruel. The Vestals were 6 women chosen as children, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, from patrician families. Once inducted, they were no longer under the control of their fathers or potential husbands. Legally, they stepped outside the usual female roles in Roman society. They had unprecedented privileges. They could own property, write wills, free slaves, and, get this, even vote in certain religious matters. In some ways, they were more powerful than most Roman men, but all of that came with one non-negotiable condition: absolute celibacy. Their role was to tend the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth and home. That flame symbolised the life of Rome itself. If it went out, people panicked, like full-blown collapse of the Republic panic. And if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the belief was that the gods would turn their wrath on the city. Floods, plagues, enemy invasions, and bad omens at breakfast. So to avoid all that, the law dictated swift, brutal justice. But here's where the law gets deeply creepy. Since it was sacrilegious to execute a Vestal directly, spilling her blood would anger the gods even more. They worked around it with a weird loophole. She'd be placed in an underground chamber, given a loaf of bread, a lamp, and some water, and then the door would be sealed. Technically, the state didn't kill her. She just happened to die while in a room with no exit. Totally different. There are several recorded instances of this grim ritual, and they're always described with cold ceremony. One of the most infamous cases involved a Vestal named Cornelia, who was accused during the reign of Domitian. As she was led to her tomb, she reportedly screamed that she was innocent, crying out to the gods for justice. According to Roman historians, the crowd stayed silent. No one protested. No one intervened. Because once the accusation was made, especially if it came from the emperor, it was game over. But what's weird is how little evidence was needed to accuse a Vestal. It wasn't a matter of catching someone in the act. You didn't need witnesses or proof, just suspicion, maybe a rumour, maybe political motive. Some scholars believe that these trials were often convenient purges, wrapped in piety. Got a political rival? Accuse his daughter of breaking a vow. Need a scapegoat for a bad harvest or military loss? Point the finger at the flamekeepers. Even the alleged lovers faced brutal fates. If a man was found guilty of sleeping with a Vestal, he was flogged to death. Publicly, sometimes in the forum. In one recorded case, the accused man was dragged through the streets and beaten until his bones cracked audibly. The logic was, if the gods were angry, someone had to pay, preferably two people, and yet not every case ended in burial. There are whispers in historical records of Vestals being falsely accused and somehow escaping their sentence. One legend tells of a Vestal who proved her innocence by carrying a sieve full of water from the Tiber to the temple without spilling a drop. Another supposedly caused a dying tree to bloom again just by touching it. Whether you believe these stories or not, they hint at a legal system so tangled in superstition, even miracles had legal weight. Now for your fringe fact, Vestals were also used as living lie detectors. Because they were considered pure and divinely favoured, their presence was thought to reveal truth and dispel deceit. If two parties were in a legal dispute, a Vestal might be summoned to stand in the courtroom, not to speak, but just to exist in the room. Her mere presence was supposed to shame liars into silence or make the guilty squirm. Picture that, a silent woman in white robes, flanked by lictors entering a courtroom like a human polygraph. That's Roman legal drama for you. Still, despite the terrifying penalties, being a Vestal was a coveted position. Families fought for the honour. The role came with high status, financial perks, and legal freedoms no other women had. And after serving 30 years, 10 learning, 10 performing, 10 teaching, a Vestal could retire. She could even marry. Though, good luck finding a man brave enough to woo a woman who once walked through sacred fire and held the fate of Rome in her hands. Probably made Tintra a bit awkward. Imagine it now. Twilight in Rome, temple fires flickering, the streets growing quiet as the Vestals pass through in their ivory robes. Citizens step aside, bowing their heads. Somewhere a young girl has just been selected for the role, leaving her family behind. She won't speak to them again for years. Her new home is the Temple of Vesta, where the law is both shield and sword. And as she lays down to sleep, she knows that one wrong step, one secret glance, one accidental whisper of intimacy could be the end. So yes, Rome gave these women power, but it also placed them in a cage made of marble and fear, where the slightest crack could shatter their entire world. Sacred? Definitely. Safe? Not even close. Now let's talk about a Roman emperor who looked at all this sexual legislation, sacred priestesses, Julian morality laws, oaths of celibacy and civic virtue, and said, you know what, we're having way too much fun. That emperor was Augustus, and tonight we're diving into the legendary, weirdly bureaucratic party crash known as the orgy laws of Rome. Yes, Augustus passed actual laws to regulate, restrict, and sometimes criminalise the sheer volume of debauchery happening in Roman homes, villas, and especially those wild, wine-soaked dinner parties where anything might happen after the fourth course. Let's backtrack just a little first. By the time Augustus took power in 27 BCE, Rome was basically crawling out of decades of civil war, political assassinations, and a level of social chaos that makes the wildest house party look like a church bake sale. There were rumours of noble women running underground brothels, senators engaging in costume parties that ended with orgies in the atrium, and feasts that lasted days, complete with human fountains pouring wine from their mouths. And yes, that last one is real. Caligula took the concept and ran with it. So Augustus decided Rome needed morality. Enter the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus and the Lex Julia de Adulterius Coascendis. a pair of legal buzzkills that tried to whip the Roman elite back into shape. These laws encouraged marriage, criminalised adultery, and penalised celibacy. That's right, being unmarried could literally cost you money, inheritance rights, or even your seat in the Senate. Augustus's reasoning? Fewer marriages meant fewer Roman babies, and the empire needed more citizens to man its armies and fill its tax rolls, and nothing kills a good orgy like a state-mandated wedding. So how did these orgy laws actually work? Well, they weren't labelled that in writing, but make no mistake, Augustus had his eye on Rome's favourite pastime, large private gatherings involving mixed company, especially those with musical entertainment, excessive drinking and, how shall we say, physical liberties, were suddenly seen as a moral threat. You couldn't just invite 20 people over, uncork a dozen amphoras of wine, and see where the night went. The moment your gathering got too big, too loud, or too naked, you were officially on the state's radar. And it wasn't just citizens being judged. Augustus employed a group of censors, essentially ancient morality police, who could walk into your home and assess your virtue, or lack thereof. They monitored behaviour, imposed penalties, and could demote your social rank if they found your lifestyle a little too spicy. Imagine a guy with a scroll and a disapproving stare knocking on your door during dessert to check if everyone had their tunics on. Party foul of the highest order. But here's the thing, Augustus didn't stop with parties. He targeted the sex economy too. Prostitution had always been legal in Rome, but now sex workers had to register with the state. Their names were recorded, their status was formalised, and, this is real, they were forbidden from wearing the clothing of respectable women. That means no fancy stolas, no head coverings, nothing that could blur the social line between a wife and a working girl. Roman law was extremely concerned with appearance. If you were breaking the law, you better look like it. Now here's a wonderfully bizarre fringe detail. Under Augustus's laws, you could be prosecuted retroactively. Let's say you'd had an affair 5 years ago. If someone decided to report it now, and you couldn't prove you were married or divorced at the time, you were toast. One famous case involved a man named Antonius Julianus, who had to produce handwritten love letters as evidence against himself to prove he didn't violate the morality laws. Yes, ancient Romans had to dig up their own receipts to show how naughty they were. And while these laws were framed as moral reform, they quickly became political weapons. If you wanted to take down a rival, accusing them of adultery or hosting illicit parties was a fast-track route to disgrace. Accusations didn't require much proof, just some servant's gossip, a well-timed letter, or a conveniently timed visit from a censor. The line between sexual misconduct and political sabotage blurred so hard it might as well have been a toga caught in a wine jug. But here's where the hypocrisy really shines. While Augustus was writing these laws, his own house was basically a walking tabloid. His daughter, Julia, yes, the same one we met back in section 7, was infamous for her lavish public affairs. She supposedly had trysts in the forum, in temples, even on the rostra where her father gave speeches. She threw parties that made senators blush, and the law did catch up with her. Augustus banished her to the island of Pandateria, forbade her from drinking wine, and essentially erased her from public life. But by then, the damage was done. The people were already whispering. If Augustus couldn't control his own family, what right did he have to control everyone else's bedrooms? And scholars still argue today, did Augustus really believe in this moral campaign? Or was it just a strategic ploy to reassert control over the increasingly chaotic elite? Some think he was a true believer, desperate to rebuild Rome's foundations after decades of moral decay. Others believe it was all optics, a power move wrapped in virtue signalling. Meanwhile, Roman parties didn't stop, they just went underground. Literally. Wealthy citizens built elaborate banquet halls beneath their villas, complete with mosaics, fountains and private rooms, all hidden from prying eyes. The orgies continued, only now with more paranoia. Couches were placed strategically, wine servers were vetted, musicians were sworn to secrecy. The bacchanalia evolved, not disappeared. So imagine this, a moonlit garden in the hills of the Aventine. A few cloaked figures arrive at the back gate. Inside, a musician tunes a lyre. Servants light oil lamps, cushions are fluffed, wine is poured, but outside a censor leans in the shadows, watching, waiting, scroll in hand. The host nervously counts the guests. 11, good, 12, too many. Someone puts out the incense just in case the smell wafts too far. Welcome to a Roman party in the age of Augustus. Half celebration, half courtroom waiting to happen. And yet, even under all that pressure, Rome kept finding ways to live, laugh, and seduce. Laws can only stretch so far before the people dance right around them. And the orgy laws, let's just say they might have cleaned up a few statues, but they never cleaned up the human heart. Now we're heading east, out of the marble halls and vine-draped courtyards of Rome, into a world where sex wasn't just about law or religion. It was medicine, magic, and metaphysics all rolled into one scroll. Welcome to ancient China, where the ruling dynasties believed that proper intimacy could literally balance the cosmos, lengthen your life, and ensure the strength of the empire. And yes, there were bedroom laws, but they looked nothing like the ones we've seen so far. This wasn't about punishment. It was about harmony, ritual timing, and occasionally some truly awkward court officials whose job was to track the emperor's nocturnal schedule with a bamboo stylus. This is what scholars sometimes call the mandate of the bedroom, a deeply Confucian meets Taoist idea that a ruler's sexual conduct had direct consequences for the empire's stability. In ancient China, especially during the Han Dynasty, circa 200 BC to 200 CE, the emperor wasn't just the head of state. He was the son of heaven, the bridge between the mortal world and the divine order. If he was having too much sex, chaos. If he was having too little, even worse. There had to be balance, measured, calculated, and of course recorded. Here's how it worked. The emperor had a harem, sometimes hundreds of concubines, categorized by rank, age, and astrological compatibility. The higher-ranking ones lived closest to the imperial bedchamber, and every night the emperor's eunuchs, who ran the harem with terrifying precision, would present him with a bamboo tally inscribed with a concubine's name. If he chose her, the record would note the time, location, and duration of the visit. The goal? Track conception and ensure no one faked a pregnancy to leapfrog the social ladder. You think HR paperwork is bad? Try filing a celestial coitus report. But this wasn't just about controlling the harem. There were actual legal expectations for how often and when the emperor was supposed to be, active. Taoist medical texts from the period, some of which were studied at the imperial court, laid out very specific recommendations: how many times a week a ruler should ejaculate, which days were most auspicious, and even which sexual positions aligned with the 5 elements. A little too much fire. Better avoid the tiger pounce and go with how the tortoise slide. No, I'm not making that up. These were real metaphors used in official documents. And while this sounds like a luxurious nightmare, there was deep philosophy behind it. Taoist principles held that Jing, the life essence, could be depleted by reckless sex, especially ejaculation. For men, the trick was to engage in sex without release, preserving their vitality while absorbing the feminine yin energy of their partners. Women, on the other hand, were encouraged to climax freely. Yes, in this one ancient culture, women had the legal and philosophical upper hand in bed, at least according to theory. Whether or not this held true in practice is, let's say, open to interpretation. Still, these ideas weren't fringe. They were baked into law and practice. Medical officials and court advisors would often intervene if they thought the emperor was exhausting himself. A documented case from the Han Dynasty shows ministers petitioning the emperor to limit his sexual activities so he wouldn't become weak in the limbs and cloudy of thought. Basically, "Your Majesty, please stop sleeping with everyone. You're ruining national policy." And the strangest part? The sex calendar. Yes, it existed. Some courts maintained a formal calendar detailing which concubines were scheduled for which nights, spaced out to ensure a proper rotation. This was partly to prevent favouritism, which led to political chaos, but also to spread the chance of royal conception across the harem. Legal texts even advised emperors to avoid sex during eclipses, thunderstorms, and certain lunar phases, because of course you wouldn't want to create an heir during a time of celestial imbalance. That's just bad cosmic etiquette. Here's a fringe fact that's so delightful it almost doesn't feel real. If a concubine became pregnant, the emperor was required by law and ritual to visit her regularly and provide emotional support. Yes, ancient Chinese sex law made room for cuddles. A whole section of Han Dynasty etiquette outlined how an emperor should engage with his expectant partners to ensure the baby grew up balanced and peaceful. He was supposed to talk to the belly, give the mother silk gifts, and generally behave like a doting boyfriend from a Confucian-sponsored rom-com, but as always, scholars argue. Some say the sexual manuals and records were more aspirational than realistic. ancient imperial fan fiction, if you will. Others point to burial sites where concubines were buried with luxury goods and ceremonial respect, suggesting that their roles were taken very seriously, at least in the upper ranks. And yet in some dynasties, concubines who didn't bear children within a certain period were retired, or worse, relegated to menial labour within the palace. So the mandate of the bedroom wasn't all rose petals and whispered moon poetry. There were sharp legal teeth under all that silk. Now picture it. You're a concubine in the Forbidden City. You've spent days in ritual cleansing, had your chart checked by the palace astrologer, and tonight your tally is in the emperor's hand. Eunuchs shuffle down the marble corridor, silent and serious. You're escorted to the imperial chamber, where incense curls like mist and every movement is a matter of protocol. Nothing is improvised. Every pillow is placed by decree, every robe folded to avoid disrespecting the dragon motif. And after it's all over, your name goes back into the ledger, checked, stamped, archived. So yes, in ancient China, sex was cosmic duty. The law didn't just monitor it, it orchestrated it. Your body wasn't just yours, it was part of the empire's machinery, a gear in the great spinning wheel of dynasty and destiny. Love, pleasure, intimacy, those were nice side effects. But the real goal? Balance the heavens, fill the cradle, and make sure someone was tracking everything, with a bamboo tally and impeccable calligraphy. Let's stay in ancient China a little longer, because while the imperial court was busy calculating sex schedules like an astrologically charged Excel sheet, the common people and spiritual seekers had their own ideas about intimacy, ones that reached far beyond politics and bloodlines. Tonight, we're curling up with a flickering lantern, listening to the low drone of a bamboo flute, and flipping through the pages of the Taoist sex manuals, a genre of ancient Chinese literature that turned sex into medicine, philosophy, and frankly, a bit of metaphysical performance art. So here's the thing. Taoism wasn't about laws in the conventional sense. It wasn't a religion that sent people to hell for thinking impure thoughts, but it did produce a whole library of texts that treated sex as a deeply important part of human health and cosmic alignment. These guides weren't just whispered between lovers, they were sometimes commissioned by nobles, studied by court physicians, and used by everyday folks looking for spiritual enlightenment or, better stamina. The heart of Taoist sex teachings was all about harmony of energies, yin and yang, the feminine and masculine principles that flowed through everything. When those forces were balanced during intercourse, practitioners believed they could enhance their longevity, prevent disease, and even reach mystical states of awareness. If you thought sex was just about reproduction or pleasure, well, the Taoists would hand you a brush, a scroll, and a lot of awkward diagrams, and tell you to sit down and take some notes. One of the core ideas was Jing, the life essence that resided in bodily fluids, especially semen. For men, the idea was to retain Jing, not spend it. That meant learning how to have sex without climaxing, or by mastering the art of returning the semen to the brain. And yes, that's a real phrase from text like the Sunu Jing, the classic of the plain girl. The image might sound medically improbable, okay, impossible, but the goal was metaphorical. Harness vital force and let it nourish your spirit, rather than waste away in a moment of sweaty abandon. Women, interestingly, were encouraged to orgasm, repeatedly. Their yin energy was thought to be restorative to men, and the more excited a woman became, the more spiritual power could be absorbed. In some texts, women were even instructed in various breathing techniques and internal massages to increase their sexual energy and stimulate the flow of qi, or life force. Suddenly those 1990s yoga classes seem a little less edgy, huh? The manuals were thorough. They described dozens of positions, each with evocative names like White Tiger Pouncing on Prey, The Monkey Steals the Peach, and The Jade Stem Meets the Golden Gate. Sound like kung fu moves? That's because they kind of were. Many of these guides linked sex with martial arts, medicine, and even battlefield strategy. One text compared lovemaking to a general planning his attack. Observe, wait, strike with precision, then withdraw to restore your strength. Pillow talk? More like campaign logistics. But let's be clear, this wasn't a free-for-all. Taoist sex teachings were filled with do's and don'ts, and many of them leaned heavily into calendar law. You weren't supposed to have sex on certain days of the month, especially during eclipses or storms. One text warned that intercourse during the 1st and 15th days of the lunar cycle would scatter the soul and damage the bones. Another suggested avoiding intimacy on the 3rd and 7th decks, unless you were trying to summon demons. So mark your calendar accordingly. Here's your fringe fact. Some of these manuals were so influential that emperors had official sexologists in court. Yes, that was a real job. These physicians would prescribe sexual regimens to help balance the emperor's health and moods. Too angry, spend a night with a yin-heavy concubine born under a water sign. Too sluggish, try a tiger-natured partner with metal energy. And if the emperor ignored their advice, well, that could lead to loss of Jing, premature aging, or, if you believe the more dramatic scrolls, unseasonal rain and national misfortune. And this wasn't just for emperors. Taoist monasteries and lay followers sometimes practiced sexual cultivation as a form of internal alchemy. In some cases, men and women trained together in semi-secret rituals that were part meditation, part breathwork, and part, well, the part you're thinking. But the goal wasn't pleasure, it was transcendence. Practitioners believed that through disciplined sexual union, they could unlock immortality or at the very least purify their spiritual core. The highest level of mastery, union without emission. Honestly, sounds stressful. But not everyone was on board. Confucian scholars, especially during the more conservative dynasties, pushed back hard against these teachings. They saw the manuals as dangerous, morally loose, and a threat to the family-centered order Confucianism depended on. Some officials even tried to ban the distribution of these texts, worried they'd inspire scandal or weaken military vigour. One legal edict from the Tang dynasty called them indulgences of the body that rot the mind, which, to be fair, sounds like something your grandmother might say about internet dating apps. Yet the manuals persisted, passed down through apprenticeships and reprinted across centuries. Some were smuggled across borders, others buried with their authors, and still others were disguised as poetry to escape censorship. Even today, bits and pieces of Taoist sex wisdom find their way into modern wellness books and questionable health blogs, stripped of their mystical context and rebranded as ancient Chinese bedroom secrets. Now close your eyes and imagine a small candle-lit room in a mountain village. A young couple kneels across from each other, breathing in unison, hands resting on each other's pulse points. No words, just movement, rhythm, energy. Outside, a gentle wind stirs the bamboo leaves. Inside, the room is silent, except for the rustle of silk and the occasional awkward instruction. No, not like the phoenix, more like the carp swimming upstream. So yes, in ancient China, sex law could look like a death ledger in the emperor's harem, or it could look like a manual on how to ascend to immortality through synchronized breathing and well-timed pelvic alignment. Either way, you needed a good calendar, a sense of discipline, and probably a chiropractor. Tonight we're heading a little further south into the subcontinent of India, land of epic poems, towering temples, and the most misunderstood sex manual in human history. That's right, we're cracking open the pages of the Kama Sutra. But this isn't going to be some blushy yoga mat store overview of positions and pillows. We're going deeper into the real legal and cultural framework that made this text a guide, not just for pleasure but for social power, legal manoeuvring and personal identity in classical Indian society. First off, let's get something straight. The Kama Sutra is not just an erotic picture book. It's a dense, highly structured treatise written in Sanskrit sometime between the 3rd and 5th century CE by a scholar named Vatsyayana. And it's not all about sex. In fact, only one of the 7 books deals directly with physical techniques. The rest? They're about courtship, relationships, marriage, adultery, legal rights of courtesans, and, my favourite part, how to decorate your house to impress someone you want to sleep with. Pro tip, trained parrots and fragrant oils go a long way. But let's zoom in on the legal dimension. The Kama Sutra didn't exist in a vacuum. It was one part of a 3-part system of ancient Indian law and life: Dharma, duty; Artha, wealth; and Karma, pleasure. Each had its own set of texts and ethical codes, and together they shaped how people were expected to behave in public and private. Want to be a good citizen? You better balance all 3. Too much pleasure, and you're a hedonist. Too much duty, and you're a boring ascetic. The Kama Sutra was about lawful pleasure. When, where, how, and with whom you could seek erotic fulfillment while staying on the good side of the gods and the village elders. Now, this is where things get spicy and technical. The text lays out legal rules for courtship. For example, if a woman of equal caste consents to intercourse after a certain period of mutual affection and token gifts, the union is considered a Gandharva marriage, basically a love marriage, and yes, it had legal standing. In fact, the Kama Sutra recognises 8 different kinds of marriage, each with different implications for dowry, inheritance and social status. Some were fully blessed by priests, others were frowned upon but still valid. And then there were, well, let's just say less recommended unions involving coercion or trickery that still technically counted as marriages, though they came with penalties and social consequences. And about those penalties, women had more legal protection under Kama Sutra influenced customs than you might expect. If a man abandoned a woman after seduction, especially if she lost her virginity in the process, he could be forced to marry her or pay compensation, depending on her caste and status. The logic was economic and social. An unmarried, non-virgin woman had fewer prospects, and society demanded the man take responsibility. Of course, this only applied within the same caste. Step outside that and things got wildly more complicated, and sometimes lethal. Here's your fringe fact. The Kama Sutra includes a full legal guide for courtesans, not just etiquette, but business contracts. These women, often highly educated and financially independent, could legally bind clients into payment agreements. The manual details how to avoid being swindled, when to end a relationship for profit reasons, and how to identify a man who's just in it for the attention. It even recommends ghosting techniques if the man gets too needy. So yes, 600 years ago, courtesans were out here with prenups and boundary setting, while most nobles were still figuring out how to bathe. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. One section discusses how to seduce someone else's wife without getting killed. Because adultery was both morally and legally dangerous, especially under the Manusmriti, a contemporaneous legal text. If caught, the consequences could include public humiliation, fines, mutilation, or worse, particularly for the lower castes. The Kama Sutra dances around this with legal disclaimers like, this method should only be used if her husband is away on business for an extended period. So, helpful. And the manual was also inclusive in a way that might surprise you. It has chapters on third-gender individuals, same-sex desire, and men who enjoy passive roles with other men, described with both curiosity and respect. These weren't criminalised behaviours in the same way they were in other ancient civilizations. In fact, some texts describe male-male relations as part of temple rituals or performance art. One passage even includes techniques for male oral sex, which scholars believe points to a degree of practical knowledge and social tolerance in at least some urban centres. Still, not all scholars agree on how widespread or accepted these practices were. Some argue that the Kama Sutra represented a fantasy world for the elite, people with the time, money and silk robes to ponder abstract ethics and throw rose petals at each other. Others point to archaeological and textual evidence showing that these legal and sexual norms did influence daily life, especially in major cities like Ujjain or Varanasi, where courtesans, merchants and scholars mingled in relatively open, complex social systems. Now picture this. You're in a well-lit chamber decorated with hanging garlands, bronze oil lamps, and a trained minor bird that chirps polite compliments in Sanskrit. A woman reclines on a velvet cushion, flipping through a scroll. You arrive, freshly bathed, with a carved ivory comb and a bowl of sweet pomegranate wine. But before anything happens, she gently reminds you that if you try to skip out on your promised gift tomorrow, she has a signed tablet stating that you owe her 5 gold coins and a bolt of silk. You nod. She smiles, wufut and legally enforceable intimacy blossoms. The Kama Sutra didn't just document passion, it framed it within structure. Sex was art, but also contract. Flirtation was part of negotiation. And pleasure, it was perfectly legal, as long as it respected caste, timing, commitment, and, of course, the occasional footnote about how not to get stabbed by an angry husband. So if you thought the Kama Sutra was just a list of suggestive silhouettes and bendy poses, think again. It was a living legal document, equal parts ethics, aesthetics, and HR policy for the ancient bedroom. Turns out ancient India was way ahead of its time, complete with sexual codes, courtship loopholes, and surprisingly progressive views on love, business, and the law. Okay, so you've flirted with divine courtesans, avoided awkward dinner parties with Augustus, and navigated tantric contracts that might as well require a notary. But tonight, we're entering a darker, more suspicious part of the ancient bedroom, Because what happens when someone lies about sex, or worse, when society demands that you prove your innocence with your body? Welcome to the unsettling world of virginity trials in the Vedic age, where social purity wasn't just a virtue, it was a testable condition. We're in ancient India again, but long before the Kama Sutra, deep in the early Vedic period, roughly 1500 to 500 BCE. This was the time of hymns, fire rituals, and epic oral traditions. Society was structured around Varna, social class, and Dharma, duty, and the family unit was central to cosmic order. And while the Vedas don't exactly list out sex laws like modern legal codes, the surrounding Dharma Shastras and post-Vedic texts paint a very clear picture. Female chastity was a cornerstone of honour, status, and law. If that corner cracked, so did everything else. Now, here's where things get deeply, uncomfortably specific. In this world, a woman's virginity wasn't a private matter, it was a legal presumption, especially before marriage. Families made alliances based on a daughter's supposed purity. Dowries were negotiated with this assumption built in. If a woman was found to be not a virgin on her wedding night, it wasn't just embarrassing, it could result in annulment, legal disputes, public disgrace, and even violence, depending on caste and region. But how do you prove something so personal? Glad you didn't ask. One of the most disturbing aspects of early South Asian sex law was the ritualized virginity test. In some cases, it was informal. If the bride bled on the wedding night, she was considered proven. If not, well, out came the accusations. That little piece of blood-soaked cloth, it could make or break a woman's future. In wealthier households, it might even be presented to the elders, like a weird grim receipt, and if there was doubt. Enter the more formal rituals. One such ordeal involved the trial by fire, or at least heat. If a woman was suspected of premarital sex and denied it, she might be forced to carry a red-hot iron rod, or walk over heated coals to prove her purity. If she completed the task unscathed, or so the theory went, it meant she was innocent. Any burns, proof of guilt. It was part symbolic test, part superstitious spectacle, and 100% nightmare fuel. And yes, similar vascular trials were also used to determine fidelity in marriage. One text even describes a scenario where a wife accused of adultery is ordered to swallow a truth potion, made of cow urine and Tibetan and bark resin. If she vomits, guilty. If she doesn't, innocent. If you're wondering what happened to innocent until proven guilty, so is everyone else. Now here's a bizarre fringe twist. In some regions, if a girl failed the virginity test but your astrological chart was favourable, a priest could override the evidence. That's right. Virgo rising might just save your marriage prospects. The stars, after all, didn't lie, even if people did. Some families would even alter horoscopes. Yes, literally bribe astrologers to match the social narrative. And while that technically wasn't legal, it was common enough that later law codes started regulating astrology itself. When the stars become a legal loophole, things have definitely gotten cosmic. But the strangest part of all is this. While women were judged harshly, men were not subject to any comparable test. Male virginity was neither valued nor questioned. In fact, a young man who was a virgin by marriage age might be seen as unfit or inexperienced. So the law and society ran on a rigged system where one gender's body was a public concern and the other's was a private indulgence. Sound familiar? Now, to be fair, not all ancient Indian texts agreed on this. The Vedas themselves are relatively neutral on sex, and some later philosophical schools, like certain branches of Buddhism and Jainism, argued for spiritual purity as a mutual non-physical quality. They believed chastity was about intent, not anatomy, but those voices were drowned out by centuries of tradition that treated the female body like a legal document. Bleed and you're credible. Don't bleed and you better pray your karma's been excellent. Here's a little-known, slightly surreal footnote. In some cases, women accused of impurity could appeal to temple oracles, usually older women considered divinely inspired. These wise women would examine the accused, sometimes physically, sometimes spiritually, and deliver a verdict. It wasn't exactly a fair trial, but it was sometimes more forgiving than the hot rod route. And if the oracle declared you pure, that judgment could overturn a husband's rejection. Basically, it was like having a celestial notary public for your hymen. Imagine it now. A village square bathed in early morning sun. A young bride stands trembling before the local elders, her new husband glaring, his mother weeping dramatically into her sari. A cloth lies limp in the breeze, white, untouched, no blood. The whispers begin. A priest steps forward, holding a small brass dish and a stick of burning incense. He mutters a prayer, asks the girl to take 3 steps across the sand. A hush falls as she walks. The crowd waits. Her foot slips. A gasp. And just like that, verdict rendered. Guilt by stumble. You can feel the tension. The law is silent, but the people are loud. Scholars today still debate how widespread these virginity trials were. Some argue they were symbolic, rare rituals used only in extreme cases. Others point to surviving folklore and medieval texts that suggest the practice was far more common than anyone wants to admit. Either way, the message was clear. Your body could be put on trial without your consent, and the law might judge you by what it thought you should have done, not what you actually did. So next time someone waxes poetic about the purity of tradition, maybe remind them that for a lot of ancient women, purity came with heat, humiliation, and the terrifying weight of community judgment, often backed by shaky legal logic and a dangerous obsession with blood. Now let's drift westward, across the deserts and mountains into the solemn, firelit temples of ancient Persia, where sex wasn't just a private act or even a matter of state. It was a moral transaction closely watched by a divine accountant named Ahura Mazda. Tonight we're unravelling the stark, deeply structured rules of Zoroastrian sexual law, where purity was everything, and certain positions, yes, specific ones, were quite literally outlawed in the eyes of both the clergy and the cosmos. First, a little context. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest organised religions, shaped Persian life long before Islam entered the scene. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, if you're feeling Greek about it, this faith was all about cosmic dualism, truth versus lies, order versus chaos, purity versus defilement. And unlike some ancient systems that made room for ambiguous grey zones, Zoroastrian law was very clear. Everything you did, especially in the bedroom, tipped the scale toward good or evil. And yes, someone was keeping track. Enter the Vendidad, the Zoroastrian legal and ritual text dating from around the 5th century BCE. Think of it as a divinely sanctioned law book meets hygiene manual, and in this volume sex plays a surprisingly large role. The Vendidad doesn't just regulate adultery or incest, though those are covered too. It lays out extremely specific laws about sexual positions, bodily fluids, and even where you're allowed to do the deed. Let's start with the simple stuff, sex within marriage. For the purpose of procreation. Excellent. You're doing Ahura Mazda's work. Just make sure it's in a clean, quiet space, not near a fire, water source, or anything sacred. Do it on temple grounds or near a sacred flame. Boom! Impurity. You've just angered the gods, and now a priest has to ritually cleanse the entire area with special chants and maybe a bucket of cow urine. No joke, ritual purity was everything. But then we get to the real kicker, positions and practices that were explicitly forbidden. According to certain Zoroastrian interpretations, any act that didn't lead to reproduction, anything unnatural in their phrasing, was a sin not just against social order, but against cosmic order. That meant oral sex, anal sex, mutual masturbation, even non-procreative intercourse during a woman's period were all labelled as dru, or demonic lies, and they didn't just frown upon it. Some versions of the law assigned penalties like lashes, fines, or in more severe readings, even death. One specific section of the Vendidad outlines a legal penalty for what scholars interpret as same-sex relations between men. The language is vague, perhaps intentionally, but the law makes it clear. Sex must reinforce cosmic fertility. Anything outside that was considered nasa, or spiritual pollution. And this wasn't something you could just apologise for over tea. Depending on the priest, you might have to undergo intense purification rituals, including long periods of isolation, ritual bathing in bull's urine, known as Gomez, and recitation of specific mantras, sometimes for hours. You haven't known legal awkwardness until you've been asked to chant while reeking of fermented bovine ammonia. Here's your fringe fact. There was a loophole, sort of. Contract marriages, or sige, may have had ancient Zoroastrian precursors, allowing for temporary unions meant to fulfill sexual needs without breaking moral law. The exact details are fuzzy, and scholars still debate whether this practice came from Zoroastrian influence or emerged later under Persian Islamic culture. But the idea of temporarily legalizing a sexual union shows just how much legal systems were trying to manage desire. rather than erase it entirely. But perhaps the most startling thing about Zoroastrian sex law was its obsession with spiritual contamination through bodily fluids. Semen, menstrual blood, even sweat and saliva were considered potent transmitters of impurity when used or released inappropriately. One section describes how a man who spills seed outside of a woman must recite purification verses, wash repeatedly, and avoid sacred spaces for several days. If he skips the rituals, his impure state could literally weaken the sun. Yes, that was the belief. Private sin, cosmic consequences. Still, there was nuance. Not all sex was sinful. In fact, Zoroastrianism had a profound reverence for marital intimacy, as long as it followed the rules. The union of a man and woman in lawful marriage was seen as a small-scale reenactment of the battle between order and chaos. A faithful couple, raising children and keeping ritual cleanliness, was thought to strengthen the entire moral fabric of the universe. Not bad for what started as a date night. But don't expect much in the way of pleasure-positive discourse. The texts weren't interested in whether anyone was having a good time. The entire legal structure around sex was built to enforce function and discipline, not enjoyment. Even marital sex that was too enthusiastic, too animal-like, could be interpreted as spiritually suspect. The ideal sexual act was calm, reverent, quiet and productive. In other words, no moaning near the sacred oxen. And yet modern scholars debate just how strictly these rules were enforced. Like many ancient law codes, the Vendidad was as much an aspirational document as a daily enforcement manual. Priests probably looked the other way when newlyweds got too frisky, and there's evidence that certain communities were more lenient than others. Some regions may have interpreted the rules as guidelines, others as strict law. The consistency, let's just say ancient Persia, was no stranger to the concept of selective enforcement. Imagine it now, a young couple recently married in a quiet home on the edge of Persepolis. The walls are painted with bright vegetal motifs, oil lamps flicker, and the scent of cedarwood fills the air. They lay beside each other on a tightly woven wool rug, whispering behind drawn curtains. But before they so much as kiss, the husband rises, lights incense, and checks a small linen-bound booklet for that night's appropriate position and direction. East-facing? Check. Far out of sight? Good. And as the moment begins, both are careful not to make too much noise, lest someone outside think they're summoning Druge. So yes, Zoroastrian sex law was intense, meticulous, and steeped in metaphysical weight. It wasn't about punishing pleasure. It was about protecting a divine balance between light and dark, truth and lies. But in the process, it placed some of the most private acts under cosmic surveillance. Next time you think your love life is complicated, remember that in ancient Persia, the stakes were save the world or go take a bath in cow pee. Tonight, we shift into the candlelit halls of another ancient legal system, one that still echoes loudly today. We're opening the scrolls of ancient Hebrew purity laws, where intimacy wasn't just regulated, it was divinely choreographed. These weren't laws hidden in back rooms or discussed in whispers. They were carved into the heart of society, etched into daily routine and constantly reviewed, recited and revised. Welcome to a world where sex was sacred, but timing was everything. And sometimes the penalty for getting it wrong was exile, impurity, or a mandatory goat sacrifice. Let's start with the basics. In the Hebrew Bible, especially the book of Leviticus, sex is treated as a subject to ritual purity, moral obligation, and national health policy, all rolled into one. The priest didn't just monitor worship, they oversaw the entire structure of bodily behaviour, including everything that happened in your bedroom. If you were an ancient Israelite, your sex life came with a calendar, a checklist, and a whole lot of laundry. The most famous law, the prohibition of sex during a woman's menstrual period, called niddah in Hebrew. Leviticus 15 lays it out in extensive detail. A woman on her period was considered ritually impure for 7 days. Anyone who touched her, or even the bed she sat on, was also impure until evening. If a man had sex with her during that time, he became unclean for 7 days, and both partners could be cut off from the community. This wasn't just symbolic. The rules had real, enforceable consequences. Being in a state of impurity meant you couldn't enter the temple, couldn't offer sacrifices, and couldn't fully participate in communal life. In some eras, violators might even be forced to live outside the camp or undergo public purification rituals involving water, ashes and offerings. And no, you couldn't just say, oops, I forgot. God, according to Levitical law, didn't do loopholes. Now here's where it gets even more intense. After her menstruation, a woman had to count 7 clean days before having sex again. That made at least 12 days of abstinence per month, assuming a regular cycle. Add in post-childbirth regulations, which required 33 to 60 days of impurity, and a couple could be physically separated for nearly half the year. These rules weren't suggestions, they were law. Marital intimacy became a scheduled sacred reunion, something you had to plan for, anticipate, and ritually prepare for like a high holiday. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Those 7 clean days became the foundation of what's now known as halachic family purity law, Taharat Hamishpacha, still observed in Orthodox Jewish communities today. The process includes ritual bathing in a mikveh or ceremonial pool before resuming intimacy. And the mikveh isn't just a pretty spa. It has to be filled with rainwater or natural spring water, designed to meet very specific biblical and rabbinic specifications. In other words, this ancient law still builds buildings. But the Torah wasn't just about timing, it also prohibited specific types of relationships with chilling clarity. Leviticus 18 is basically a full spreadsheet of do-nots. Don't have sex with your sister, your stepmother, your daughter-in-law, your uncle's wife, your wife's sister while your wife is still alive, your neighbour's wife, your livestock. It's a long list. The takeaway? Keep it in your tent and keep it lawful. Violating these laws didn't just make you impure, they branded you as a transgressor against God's covenant, a threat to the entire community. One of the most hotly debated passages involves homosexual relations, particularly male-male sex, described in Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13. The language is stark. It is an abomination. But what exactly does that mean in context? Scholars still fight over it. Some argue that the law was tied to ritual purity, not personal orientation, that it targeted behaviour associated with pagan fertility cults, not same-sex love. Others insist it was a moral prohibition, designed to uphold patriarchal lineage. Either way, it was a law with serious legal teeth. The penalty was death. And yet the ancient rabbis of the Talmudic period centuries later began reinterpreting many of these laws. They added layers of nuance, exceptions, and technicalities. One famously creative workaround, the requirement that prohibited sex during menstruation was enforced by checking with a cloth to ensure purity. But how that cloth was used? Let's just say it involved some finesse. Entire Talmudic chapters debated whether one spot of blood counted, or what colour it had to be. Yes, there was literally a legal discussion about shades of red. But not all the laws were so grim. In fact, some texts emphasized the joy of sex when done within the right bounds. The Talmud includes beautiful passages about the importance of marital pleasure, even describing how a husband is obligated to please his wife. One law required merchants, who travelled frequently, to come home once a week for conjugal purposes. Don't laugh, this was enshrined in religious law. A man who denied his wife sex for too long could be taken to court, fined, or even forced to divorce her and pay full compensation. Here's another surprising fact. There were legal protections for newlyweds too. The Torah commands that a man who just got married must be exempt from military duty for a full year, so he can bring happiness to the wife he has taken. Talk about putting honeymoon rights in the Constitution. Now picture it. A stone house in a village near ancient Jerusalem. The air is warm, the oil lamp flickers low. A husband and wife sit apart for the 7th night in a row. She has counted her days, folded clean linens, and prepared for the mikveh. He's waiting outside the ritual bathhouse, a bouquet of myrrh blossoms in his hand. No touch, no glance, no flirtation until she emerges, dripping, glowing, ritually restored. Their first touch in nearly 2 weeks feels electric, sacred, like a contract being re-signed. So yes, ancient Hebrew sex law was filled with restrictions, but also structure, intentionality, and believe it or not, an undercurrent of emotional awareness. The laws were strict, but they also gave rhythm to marriage. They forced people to pause, and to wait, and to return to one another with renewed focus, even if it meant obsessing over a shade of crimson on a piece of cloth. But make no mistake, these were still laws. Break them, and you didn't just disappoint your spouse, you offended God, your ancestors, and maybe even risked bringing down a plague on the whole camp. Ancient purity wasn't a personal journey. It was a collective concern with deeply public consequences. So the next time you think your relationship has rules, just remember, some ancient couples had sex lives dictated by fire, linen, moons and goats, and sometimes that was a good day. Now let's tiptoe into one of the lesser-known corners of ancient law and religion, a hot, rocky stretch of land where boundaries between legal code, temple ritual, and deeply unsettling fertility practices blurred into something that still has archaeologists scratching their heads. Tonight, you're entering the world of the Canaanites, whose sexual customs were so provocative or so misunderstood that neighbouring civilizations tried to erase them entirely. But fragments remain, and what they suggest is both fascinating and a little creepy. A culture where sacred sex rituals and legal enforcement walked hand in very sweaty hand. We're talking roughly between 1800 and 1200 BCE in the Levant, what is now parts of Israel, Lebanon, Syria and Jordan. The Canaanites weren't a single nation but a patchwork of city-states, temples and tribal communities. Their religion was polytheistic and centred around fertility of deities like Baal, the storm god, and Asherah, the mother goddess often associated with trees, wombs and the occasional ceremonial pole. No, seriously, the Asherah pole was a real thing, often described in ancient texts and later outlawed by the Hebrews, who were not fans of this neighbour's vibes. One of the most infamous and debated aspects of Canaanite religion was its alleged use of ritual sex, particularly at temples. Scholars still argue over how widespread or institutionalised these practices were, but there's enough smoke to suggest a very real cultural fire. Temple precincts may have hosted women and possibly men who engaged in sexual acts as part of fertility rites. The goal wasn't pleasure per se, it was to mimic the divine union between Baal and Asherah, ensuring rain, crops and cosmic balance. You didn't just pray for rain, you reenacted the kind of union that made it happen. And here's where the legal element slithers in. In many Canaanite city-states, participation in these rituals wasn't always voluntary. In some interpretations of the surviving texts and archaeological sites, families might be expected, legally or through social pressure, to offer a daughter, or less commonly a son, for temple service, which could include these sexual rites. In return, the family might gain favour, food rations or tebkans, homesteads or tax exemptions. So yes, in some places temple sex was part of the civic duty roster, right up there with grain offerings and defensive ditch digging. Now, this is not universally agreed upon. Some scholars argue that the entire idea of sacred prostitution in Canaan is a myth manufactured by later cultures, especially the Hebrews, who had serious beef with the Canaanites. They say the stories were propaganda, meant to make the neighbours look like depraved degenerates in need of moral correction, or conveniently military conquest. But then you find things like fertility figurines buried around ancient temples, some with exaggerated hips, detailed pubic features, or inscriptions suggesting ritual use. Whether or not there was a formal sex priesthood, it's clear that sexual imagery and practice were deeply embedded in the religious and legal framework. And yes, there were laws. We don't have a full Canaanite legal code, but we do have bits and pieces from Ugarit and other Canaanite sites. Tablets that hint at marriage contracts, dowry structures, and temple service obligations. In some cases, sexual union as part of a ritual might have created a temporary sacred marriage, a concept seen elsewhere in the Near East, where a person could be legally married to a deity for a night. These weren't love matches, they were legal ceremonies with robes, chants, and probably more than a few deeply uncomfortable participants. Here's your fringe fact. Some temples had official scribes tasked with recording which citizens participated in rituals, who donated what and, yes, who performed which acts with whom. These weren't anonymous encounters. If your name ended up on a clay tablet in the temple archives, that meant you had civic skin in the game. That also meant that sex wasn't just a personal act. It could be used as evidence in legal disputes, especially around land inheritance or priesthood succession. One story fragment even suggests that certain children born from these temple unions were raised in the temple as future priests or priestesses, part divine offering, part PR stunt, and fully bound to the temple's legal authority. These kids might never know their biological fathers, but they'd be raised under strict codes, taught to chant the right prayers, prepare the sacrifices, and maybe even, someday, perform the same rituals that created them. That's a whole new level of legacy planning. And here's where it all gets very uncomfortable. Later Hebrew laws, especially in Deuteronomy, explicitly outlawed Canaanite sex rituals, calling them abominations and warning that anyone engaging in them would be cut off from the community. They even used the word Kedesha to describe temple women, often translated as prostitutes, but more accurately rendered as consecrated ones. The translation choices here are not neutral. They reflect a centuries-long cultural smear campaign, one aimed at stamping out a religion where sex and law were deliberately fused. But zoom in, and you see a culture trying to make sense of fertility, death, and cosmic survival. These rituals weren't just orgies in olive groves. They were acts of desperation and devotion, performed in times of drought, famine, and war. If mimicking divine union could make the clouds open up, you did what you had to do, and maybe brought a goat as backup. Even if it meant breaking modern sensibilities into 1,000 little judgmental pieces. Now picture it. A limestone temple rises on a dusty hill above a terraced vineyard. Inside, the air is thick with cedar smoke and the scent of crushed figs. A procession winds around the altar, chanting invocations to Baal. At the centre of it all, 2 participants step forward, an offering and a priest. Their union is brief, ceremonial, and entirely public. A scribe records the moment, names are chanted, and somewhere a farmer prays for rain. It's not romantic, it's legal, and it might just save the village. So yes, the Canaanites may have crossed some lines, or maybe they were working off a rulebook we'll never fully understand, but one thing's for sure. In their world, sex wasn't just pleasure or scandal. It was contract, ritual, and cosmic collaboration. And sometimes the difference between divine favour and social exile was just one very uncomfortable ceremony away. Tonight we trade the city-states and codified law books for something mistier, older, and wrapped in foggy legend. Welcome to the world of the Celtic Druids, a society where sex laws weren't carved into stone tablets or written in scrolls, but passed by memory, whispered over mead, and enforced with bone-deep ritual and deeply complex social customs. The Celts, scattered across Iron Age Britain, Ireland, Gaul, Hull, and parts of Central Europe may not have left behind great libraries of legal texts, but what they did leave, through oral tradition, later Roman accounts, and surviving Brecon laws in Ireland, paints a picture of a society with a legal and spiritual relationship to sex that was surprisingly flexible and also surprisingly terrifying. Let's begin with what we do know. In early Celtic society, sex and marriage were not strictly bound to monogamy. In fact, polyamory was not only tolerated, it was structured. There were at least 10 different kinds of legal unions recognised in medieval Irish Brecon law, which preserved pre-Christian Celtic customs, ranging from the full marriage of equals to arrangements based on shared property, fertility pacts, and even casual cohabitation. Some of these unions lasted a lifetime. Others were more like legally sanctioned, see how this goes setups. And these weren't just soft social gestures, they were legally actionable. Each type of union came with rules about what happened when things ended, who got to keep the cows, the house, or the silver ring you wore to festival last spring. Brecon law even had guidelines for what to do if you lived together, but never actually got around to sleeping with each other. You'd be taxed less, but still, technically, married. That's right, the Celts had so laws for ghosting. But don't think this was some free love utopia. There were strict rules around fidelity, especially once children entered the picture. If you cheated, or fathered a child outside your official union, you might face fines, called erek or lognenek, which translates to honour price. Basically, your social reputation had a literal price tag. The more important you were, the more expensive your mistakes. And yes, this went both ways. Women could sue men for breaking a contract or seducing them under false pretenses. If the man promised gifts or property in exchange for intimacy and didn't follow through, that was fraud. And in early Irish law, fraud was punishable by confiscation of land, livestock, or even your sword. Now here's a spicy detail. The Celts believed that some women had sexual rights built into their status, particularly noble women and poetesses. If a woman of high rank was dishonoured, say harassed or assaulted, her honour price could be equal to that of a chieftain. And don't let the flowing dresses and braids fool you. Celtic women had legal standing, the right to inherit land, and the ability to initiate divorce. Some records even describe female druids, spiritual leaders who could preside over legal matters, property disputes, and, in at least one obscure account, even bless marriages by walking a couple in a circle under the moon, chanting over a cauldron. Who needs a notary when you have a singing witch with a moonstone crown? but perhaps the most mind-bending part of Celtic sex lore was its relationship to transgression and transformation. In some druidic myths, breaking a sexual taboo didn't just lead to punishment. It could change your form, your fortune, or your fate. One tale tells of a warrior who lies with a goddess in disguise, only to be cursed into a deer until he learns humility. Another legend speaks of a man who violates the 3 taboos of union, a poetic code for incest, coercion, and oath-breaking, and is swallowed by the earth. These weren't just stories, they were cautionary tales, teaching the next generation which sacred lines not to cross. And speaking of sacred lines, guess what the Celts had? Ritualised sex festivals. Yup. Especially during Beltane, the spring fire festival, young couples were allowed, some say encouraged, to pair off in the woods for the night. In some regions, the community even built large beds of hay for these pairings. It was considered a fertility blessing, both for the land and for the people. These unions weren't necessarily binding, but if a child came of it, both parties were legally responsible. The community kept track. The druids didn't need scrolls. They had memories sharp as blades and a long view of lineage. Here's your fringe fact for the night. The Celts may have had a recognised third gender category, particularly in religious or bardic circles. Some old Gaelic poems refer to men who live as women, not mockingly, but as spiritual beings with special insight. There's even a fragment of Brecon law that suggests gender presentation could determine legal compensation in sexual disputes. In other words, gender wasn't fixed by biology alone. The law adjusted for who you were living as, a remarkably modern concept tucked inside a misty oral code passed from druid to druid beside a sacred oak. Now picture it, a highland hill beneath the moon, fires crackling, drums pulsing like thunder in the veins. A circle of dancers moves beneath the stars. In the shadows, lovers slip away into the tall grass. In the morning they'll be judged, not by shame, but by whether they honoured their word, upheld their agreements and showed respect. A woman may visit the druid and announce a child on the way. Her partner, if he tries to deny it, will face the council. If he lies, he pays. If he flees, he loses his sword. So yes, Celtic sex law was complex, fluid, poetic, and oddly bureaucratic. You could love who you wanted, live how you pleased, but only if you kept your oaths, respected the balance, and knew the cost of breaking someone's honour, because in the world of the druids, sex wasn't a secret. It was a sacred transaction, a spark traded beneath stars, legally binding and soul-deep. Miss the ritual, skip the honour, and you might just find yourself turned into a stag, running through the forest with the consequences nipping at your heels. Tonight we swap moonlit rituals and druidic chants for something a little colder, rougher, and far more pragmatic, because in the icy world of the Vikings, sex wasn't just about pleasure, honour, or divine fertility. It was about status, it was about reputation. And when you crossed the line, whether by force, by insult, or just by sleeping with the wrong person, there was a price to pay, literally. Welcome to the Norse legal system, where the punishment for sexual crimes was measured in wergild, a cash value for your crime, your body, and your honour. Let's set the scene. It's 9th century Scandinavia. Snow drifts against longhouses, smoke curls from chimneys, and the community is bound together not by centralised law codes, but by thing assemblies, open-air courts where free men gathered to recite law, settle disputes, and occasionally challenge each other to duels. No written records at first, just memory, reputation, and a whole lot of shouting. But as the Viking world expanded and contact with Christian Europe increased, these laws were finally written down in texts like the Gragas in Iceland and the Gulathing law in Norway. And while Norse societies were often viewed as violent or wild, they were very particular when it came to sexual behaviour. There were no sacred virgins or ritual purity codes here, but there were rules, mostly about who you could sleep with, who you couldn't, and what it cost you when things went sideways. Let's start with adultery. In Norse culture, marriage was an economic alliance, and adultery, particularly if a man slept with another man's wife, was treated as property damage. If caught, the offending man could be fined or forced into a duel. The woman depends. In some regions, a wife caught in adultery could be divorced without compensation, publicly humiliated, or worse. In other versions of the law, she might be allowed to plead her case, especially if the husband had been neglectful. Either way, the whole village was going to hear about it. Now, if a man had sex with a slave woman, things got even trickier. Slavery was common in Viking societies, and enslaved women had almost no rights. A free man could legally sleep with his slave, but if another man did so without permission, it was considered both theft and rape, punishable by fine or public flogging. And if the slave became pregnant, that child was typically considered property unless manumitted by the owner. Some slaves were elevated to concubine status, which came with a few protections, others not so lucky. Then there were insults, and this is where Viking sex law gets very weird and very specific. In Norse culture, honour was everything, and accusing someone of unmanly sexual behaviour could trigger a blood feud. There were actual laws against calling a man Arga, which loosely translates to unmanly or sexually passive. If you said it out loud in public, you had to back it up in court or fight to the death. Because in this world, being accused of taking a submissive role in sex, especially with another man, was not only shameful, it was legally actionable. Here's the wild part. Viking law didn't criminalise homosexual acts per se, but it criminalised the accusation of being a sexual bottom. That's right, you could do what you wanted behind closed doors, but don't call someone else out unless you were ready to duel at dawn. This law was less about sexual morality and more about social dominance. To be penetrated was to be humiliated, emasculated and legally damaged, and that kind of damage could be measured in silver. Enter the concept of burgild, or man price. This was the foundational legal tool in Viking society, a system that assigned a monetary value to every free person. If you injured someone, killed someone, or violated their social status, say by assaulting them or dishonouring their spouse, you had to pay their burgild. And yes, sexual crimes fell under this category. Rape had a specific price, as did seduction, unwanted touching, or even publicly propositioning someone's wife. The higher the status of the victim, the more you paid. And if you couldn't pay, things escalated. You might be outlawed, literally cast out of the legal system, with no protection from harm. Anyone could kill you without consequence. Your name was removed from the community's legal memory. It was basically death by deletion. Now here's your fringe fact. Norse women, at least free ones, had more sexual autonomy than you might think. A woman could initiate divorce by declaring dissatisfaction in front of witnesses. If her husband was impotent, abusive, or just generally insufferable, she could walk away and claim part of the household goods. In sagas, we see women confronting their husbands, rejecting suitors, and even seducing warriors to secure alliances. They weren't always treated equally, but they weren't silent either, and sex wasn't always tied to marriage. The Aldonari, or lifelong companion, could be a romantic partner outside marriage, recognised socially but not legally. In some cases, children from these unions were acknowledged and given inheritance rights. In others, they were considered bastards with limited claims. It all depended on local custom and, let's be honest, the mood of the local chieftain. One Icelandic tale tells of a woman named Un who, after the death of her husband, refused every suitor, managed her farm, and lived as an independent matriarch for decades. Her romantic history is never questioned. Her legal power? Unshakable. It's a reminder that in Viking society, sexual reputation and legal standing were not always tied to submission or silence. Now picture it. A cold stone hall, lit by firelight. A man stands before the local thing, accused of bedding another man's wife. The husband demands burgild, 12 ounces of silver and 2 oxen. The accused refuses. The community murmurs. The chieftain bangs his staff and declares the fine doubled. If the man won't pay, he'll be outlawed by spring. His property gone, his name scratched from the log, and all because of one roll in the hay with the wrong woman. So yes, in the Viking world, sex was never just personal. It was a transaction, a risk, a matter of public currency and private caution. Honour lived and died by who you touched, when, and whether anyone saw you do it, and the price for stepping over the line. Not guilt, not shame, just cold hard silver, and maybe an axe to the chest. Tonight we leave the icy fjords behind and descend into the sweltering perfumed temples of Aztec Mesoamerica, where sex wasn't just part of daily life, it was fused into the very structure of the cosmos. In this world, erotic energy wasn't something to be hidden or feared, it was sacred fuel. But don't mistake that for permissiveness. The Aztecs had some of the most rigid, contradictory and theatrical sex laws in the ancient world, and if you broke them, you didn't just lose your reputation, you might end up skinned alive, or sacrificed on an obsidian altar under the watchful eye of 1,000 gods. Let's get one thing straight right away. Aztec society was obsessed with duality. Life and death, light and dark, male and female, sexual energy, tlazolli, was part of this balance, something powerful and dangerous that had to be carefully channeled through law, ritual and warfare. And yes, you read that right. Sex was legally connected to war. Enter the Flower Wars, semi-ritual battles fought between the Aztecs and their neighbours, not always for conquest but for captives, which were needed for sacrificial rituals. Some scholars argue that these wars were tied to agricultural and fertility cycles, mimicking the union of divine forces through combat and blood. Captives weren't just killed, they were offered, often during festivals of fertility and renewal, where the boundaries between war, sacrifice and sex got surprisingly blurry. During festivals like Tlacaxipahualistli, good luck pronouncing that while half asleep, young warriors were paraded through the streets, often naked or minimally clothed, representing their connection to the earth and the gods. Female priestesses, some of whom were sexually abstinent, others not, played roles in these public spectacles, dancing, singing, and sometimes symbolically mating with the warrior before his death. These acts weren't casual, they were codified. Legalized forms of ritual intimacy performed to balance the world. You didn't just flirt with the high priestess, you followed her choreography, her chants, her timing, and if you messed it up, you might offend a god and doom your entire region's maize harvest. The average Aztec, however, wasn't out there rolling around in flower petals with death priests. Their sex laws were brutally strict. Premarital sex for commoners was frowned upon but not always punished, unless you got caught, or unless you were training to become a priest or noble. Then things got lethal. Virginity wasn't just expected, it was monitored, especially for women destined for elite marriage alliances or religious service. Adultery. That's where things took a sharp obsidian turn. Aztec law prescribed death by stoning, strangulation or public disembowelment for adulterers, and not just the married woman. Her lover, if caught, could be executed alongside her. In some cases, the penalty involved parading the guilty through the marketplace, covered in cactus needles or human excrement, before being led to their death. Yes, that actually happened. You don't get to call yourself a world power without a little dramatic flair. But here's where it gets bizarre. Aztec society also had legalized institutions of sex, including state-sanctioned prostitution, particularly in urban centres like Tenochtitlan. These women, often referred to as a Huiltiltin, worked in designated neighbourhoods and were expected to follow strict rules. No theft, no dishonesty, no flirting outside the brothel. And while they were often stigmatised, they were also legally protected. Clients who refused to pay or abused them could be punished by the state. If a woman chose to leave sex work, she had to undergo a ritual cleansing ceremony, including fasting, bath house purification, and formal reintegration into community life. And here's a fringe fact that'll stick with you. Aztec sex education was mandatory. No, really. From around age 12, boys and girls were sent to separate schools, Telpochcali for commoners, Calmacac for noblers, and both were taught about sexual conduct in extreme detail. Girls were told to guard their purity with the ferocity of a jaguar. Boys were warned that too much sex, or even masturbation, would melt their bones and make them unfit for military service. Sex wasn't just physical, it was soul-taxing. Abuse it, and you risked spirit death. And no one wanted to be reincarnated as a lizard. And yet, Aztec mythology includes gods and spirits with fluid or dual sexual identities. The goddess Tlazolteotl, known as the Eater of Filth, presided over both sex and purification. People confessed their sexual sins to her, and she devoured them, cleansing the soul. She was both revered and feared. One minute she's urging indulgence. The next, she's threatening to rip your liver out for it. Typical mum energy. So imagine it. A nighttime festival along the causeways of Tenochtitlan. The air is thick with incense, sweat, and flower petals. A young man, face painted, nerves crackling, approaches the temple steps. Around him, dancers move in a slow circle. Above him, a priestess in gold and obsidian chants a hymn to Xochipilli, god of pleasure and art. Tonight, the line between sin and ritual dissolves. He will die before dawn, his blood watering the earth. But for a moment, just one, he is part of something sacred. something cosmic, something terrifyingly erotic and entirely legal, because in the Aztec world, sex was law, ritual, economy, and punishment. It could bless or destroy you, it could elevate your spirit, or quite literally spill your guts. And always, it had a purpose: to keep the sun rising, the maize growing, and the gods momentarily satisfied. Tonight we're staying in the rich, steamy folds of Mesoamerica, but trading obsidian altars and jaguar masks for something subtler, more intricate, and dare we say, bureaucratic. Welcome to the Mayan world, where intimacy was not wrapped in ritual sacrifice but threaded through social contracts, class hierarchies, and quietly terrifying laws about age, consent, and reputation. If the Aztecs dramatized sex with blood and fire, the Maya turned it into a slow-burn game of timing, lineage, and legal chess. Let's get oriented. The Maya weren't a single empire, but a complex mosaic of city-states across what is now Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. Their civilization spanned over 3,000 years, and during that time they built some of the most advanced knowledge systems in the pre-Columbian world. They had astronomy, math, writing, political dynasties, and yes, a deeply structured approach to marriage and sexuality, grounded in class, calendar, and cosmic logic. Unlike the Aztecs, who often fused sex with public ritual, the Maya treated it more privately, but no less seriously. Among the nobility, marriage was about bloodlines. Sex was a political act, meant to preserve dynastic power and, occasionally, keep it all in the family. Yes, elite Maya often practiced consanguineous marriage. That's right, cousin unions and sometimes closer. The logic: keep the royal blood as pure as cacao. That wasn't just tradition, it was policy. Legal, accepted, and sometimes awkward. Now, before you raise an eyebrow, it's important to know that Mayan legal customs weren't dictated by centralized codices, like Hammurabi's laws or Roman tablets. Instead, the Maya followed a mix of oral tradition, customary law, and community enforcement, often administered by local councils or batabob, village lords. The community played judge, jury, and awkwardly silent spectator. And this community had very specific ideas about sexual propriety, particularly when it came to age and consent. Mayan girls typically married between 13 and 16, boys around 16 to 20, but only after elaborate arrangements between families. These weren't spontaneous romances. Marriage proposals were often brokered by go-betweens, who negotiated bride wealth, not to be confused with a dowry. The groom's family paid the brides, acknowledging her economic value and symbolically transferring her fertility into the husband's house. Here's where it gets fascinating and grim. If a couple was found having sex outside of this formal process, the consequences varied a lot, depending on social class. If they were both unmarried commoners, a fine might be paid, the families could agree to a marriage, and the matter might be quietly resolved. But if a noblewoman was involved, things could get brutal. Her partner could face public whipping, loss of land, or even death, especially if the man was from a lower caste. The law was crystal clear on one point: you don't mess with the fertility of the elite. For women, the consequences of unauthorized sex weren't always legal, but they were often socially catastrophic. A woman who lost her virginity before marriage, again especially among the nobility, could find herself unmarriageable, forced into labour, or quietly sent away. In some texts and oral traditions, there's mention of women being given to temples as servants, or even offered to travelling nobles as political tools. Consent in these scenarios? Let's just say the law didn't really ask. Here's a darkly intriguing fringe fact. There's evidence that Mayans conducted public virginity checks, though the records are vague and often debated. In some regions, it was customary for the bride to be examined before marriage to ensure she was still a maiden. If she wasn't, and her family had claimed otherwise, they might have to refund the bride wealth or face formal shame in the local council. If this all sounds invasive and horrifying, it was. Even by ancient standards, this was deeply performative patriarchy with legal stakes. But in contrast, there's also compelling evidence that the Maya had a nuanced view of long-term unmarried companionships. In some rural communities, non-marital partnerships, what we'd call common law marriages, were recognised, especially if children were involved. These couples had fewer legal protections, but their unions were often accepted by the community, especially if they followed basic social expectations. The law flexed a little, but only if you kept the peace. And as for same-sex relationships, the historical record is murky. Some colonial accounts, filtered through Spanish disgust, describe Mayan nobles engaging in male-male relations, especially in temple contexts or as part of mentorship. But it's hard to know how accurate these reports are. What we do know is that the Popol Vuh, the Great Quiché Maya creation epic, features several gender-fluid deities and shape-shifting figures. There's also artwork showing dual-gender spirits and ambiguous couplings. So while the legal system may have ignored or quietly erased queer identity, the mythology quietly preserved it. Meanwhile, for those who did marry formally, sex was not just expected, it was scheduled. No kidding. In some city-states, couples were expected to abstain during certain calendar days, based on astrological signs, agricultural rhythms, and priestly warnings. You didn't want to conceive on an unlucky day, that could curse the child. Some couples even consulted a daykeeper, a sacred time specialist, to find the most fertile and auspicious day for union. Ancient fertility apps? Basically. And it wasn't all abstinence and shame. In some rural customs, it was believed that a bride and groom should spend the first 3 days after marriage alone, undisturbed and extremely busy, with food delivered quietly to their hut and no one permitted to speak to them. This wasn't just to let them get to know each other. It was a blessing ritual, meant to charge their union with private intimacy before they re-entered public life. Imagine a honeymoon where your entire village is pretending you don't exist, except the old woman sliding tortillas under the door. Now picture it. A quiet village near Copan late evening. The scent of maize and burning incense drifts through the air. A young man stands before the village council, his hands shaking. He's accused of lying with the daughter of a Baitab. She is silent beside him, head bowed. The council debates not just morality, but land, lineage and shame. Will they force a marriage, demand restitution, or worse, turn him over to be punished at dawn beneath the carved stone of the plaza? The law doesn't shout, it whispers, but the consequences echo. So yes, the Maya wrapped sex in protocol, reputation and community enforcement. It wasn't about purity, it was about order. Step out of line and the cost could be steep, but stay within the bounds, and your pleasure, like your harvest, was sacred, woven into the calendar and watched by the stars. Tonight we're climbing high into the thin, crisp air of the Andes, where stone temples kiss the clouds and gold shimmers beneath the sun, God's watchful gaze. You've arrived in the heart of the Inca Empire, the largest and most meticulously organized civilization in pre-Columbian South America. And while most people remember the Inca for their roads, their terraces, and their terrifying efficiency, very few realize that they also maintained one of the most controlled and paradoxically reverent systems of sexual law anywhere in the ancient world. At the center of it all, a select group of women whose lives were as golden as the temple walls and just as locked down. They were the virgins of the sun, and their job was simple: remain pure, serve the gods, and never, ever under any circumstances fall in love. These women were known as the Akala, sometimes translated as chosen women, and their existence was part religious service, part political insurance policy, and part cautionary tale. Girls were selected around age 8 to 10, often from noble families, or occasionally from particularly beautiful commoners, and brought to live in Aklawasi, cloistered compounds where they were trained to weave fine textiles, brew chicha beer for religious ceremonies, and tend to the temples. But beneath the spinning looms and bubbling cauldrons, there was a brutal legal contract. Once you entered as an Akla, your sexuality was no longer yours. It belonged to the state, and the state, ruled by the Sapa Inca, the emperor and literal son of Inti, the sun god, took this contract very seriously. The Akla were divided into ranks. Some served the sun, maintaining perpetual virginity until death. Others were selected to become priestesses, or given to noblemen as wives, political gifts from the gods themselves. And the most prestigious were those chosen to become wives of the Inca, even if only symbolically. That's right, some of these girls became secondary wives to a divine ruler they might never actually meet. Talk about a long-distance relationship with your nation's demigod, but let's not romanticize it. The penalties for breaking a Sela vows were severe to the point of mythic horror. A girl caught in a sexual relationship, willing or not, could be buried alive, often along with the man involved. In some accounts, The offending man would be strangled with a rope made of llama hair, and the girl suffocated with the woven blanket she helped create. These weren't backroom punishments. They were public, theatrical, and meant to restore cosmic balance. And here's your fringe fact. Some Akala weren't punished, they were sacrificed. In times of drought, war, or political transition, perfectly pure girls were chosen for kapakocha, ritual sacrifice to the gods. They were often given chicha beer laced with hallucinogens, dressed in ceremonial finery, and led up a sacred mountain, where they were either buried alive or left to freeze. Many of these mummies have been found remarkably preserved, small bodies with serene expressions, as if their deaths were the peaceful end to a long, honoured path. But make no mistake, it was legalised, religiously sanctioned execution, wrapped in honour and silence. Now, not every woman in Inca society was an Akala. Outside the temples, sexual norms were surprisingly pragmatic. The Inca had a legal system called the Code of Amasua, Amalula, Amakilla. Don't steal, don't lie, don't be lazy, which extended into sexual conduct. Adultery, especially among married women, was harshly punished. A man who slept with another man's wife could be executed or forced to pay with labour taxes, effectively turned into a temporary servant for the injured husband's household. A cheating wife, often executed or mutilated. Again, the law's wrath was rarely equal. Premarital sex, however, wasn't necessarily illegal, especially among commoners. In fact, the Inca had a trial marriage system called Servinacui, where a couple could live together before making the union official. Think of it as a state-approved, let's see how this goes. If it worked out, they married. If it didn't, they parted ways without punishment. But if a pregnancy occurred, marriage was expected, and if the man refused, he could be forced to marry the woman or pay a lifelong tax to support the child. It was a system built not on moral purity, but responsibility. There's also some archaeological and textual evidence that the Inca recognised third genders, particularly among people who served in spiritual or artistic roles. Spanish chroniclers mention men dressed as women, who participated in rituals and lived in special districts. It's unclear how these individuals were treated under sexual law, but in a culture that emphasised function and cosmic balance over rigid morality, it's possible they were accepted in specific roles, as long as they didn't challenge the social hierarchy. And sex wasn't just a personal affair, it was a taxable one. No joke. Inca officials kept detailed records, using quipu, those famous knotted cords, to track marriages, births, and yes, sexual behaviour. If a man fathered too many children with too many women, especially across village lines, he might face redistribution, land reassigned, labour increased, or punishment dispensed. It wasn't about shame, it was about census and control. The empire didn't care who you loved, as long as you weren't messing with resource allocation. Imagine it, a stone compound high in the mountains. Inside, dozens of young girls kneel in silence, fingers flying over alpaca wool, eyes averted. Outside, a procession of priests marches past, chanting to Inti. One of the girls dares to look up. Her gaze meets a young messenger's. A flicker passes between them. It's enough. Later, the overseer finds them. There's no trial, no appeal. The law is older than the mountain itself. And in a village far below, a couple walks out of their shared hut. They've just finished a year of Servinacui. No baby, no problems. They shake hands, return to their families. No shame, no gossip, just a line added to a quipu somewhere. Tested union, dissolved, both returned. So yes, Inca sexual law was a study in contradictions. For the elite and the sacred, utter control. For the peasants and the practical, a little flexibility, as long as the numbers balanced and the empire ran smoothly. Sex was sacred, sex was taxable, sex could get you crowned or buried on a glacier. And behind it all, the silent Aklela watched the sun rise each day, stitching gold into fabric and bearing their desires beneath layers of law, duty, and cold mountain stone. Tonight we drift across the sea, leaving behind the high Andes and following the trade winds toward the misty archipelago of ancient Japan, where samurai trained by a lantern light and poets spilled ink over silken scrolls. But as you enter the pleasure districts and step behind the beaded curtains of Edo period tea houses, you'll find something unexpected. A sex economy so highly regulated, so delicately tiered, and so intimately tied to the legal structure of society that it became a world unto itself. Welcome to the realm of the courtesan codes, a system where desire was licensed, tracked, taxed, and dressed in embroidered silk. Let's anchor ourselves in time. The heart of this world beats during the Tokugawa shogunate, roughly 1603 to 1868. Japan was closed off from most of the world, ruled by a military government that prized stability above all else. And part of that stability included keeping a very tight lid on where, when and how people could indulge in their less refined impulses. So rather than trying to eliminate prostitution, the shogunate legalized and contained it, creating what were essentially red light districts with government paperwork. The most famous, Yoshiwara in Edo, now Tokyo, where for centuries law and lust mingled like sake and perfume. These districts weren't lawless brothels, they were practically cities within cities, with gates, patrols, tax structures and rigid class systems. And at the top of this glittering pyramid stood the oiran, the elite courtesans who were equal parts fashion icon, cultural ambassador and carefully managed commodity. To become an oiran you had to train for years. Poetry, dance, musical instruments, etiquette, calligraphy, even the art of conversation. A client couldn't just pay and walk in. He had to be invited, vetted, and then pay a fortune, sometimes enough to fund a small farm. But here's the catch. Even at the top, these women weren't free. Their lives were governed by legal codes issued by local authorities, which dictated where they could live, what they could wear, and even how many clients they could see per night. Contracts were signed, often with the brothel acting as a legal guardian. Most oiran were indentured, bound to the house by debt from their training, and could only buy their freedom if they somehow scraped together an enormous sum, or if a wealthy patron bought them out, a process known as mizuage. Now, that term, mizuage, has a very specific controversial place in Japanese sexual law. It referred to the first deflowering of a courtesan, often sold to the highest bidder as a symbolic and literal transition into womanhood. This act was regulated, taxed and documented. In some districts only certain clients were eligible. In others the act was more ceremonial than physical. But in many cases it was just as transactional as it sounds, a legally sanctioned first encounter designed to maximise revenue and reinforce control. And yes, there were actual officials assigned to make sure the rules were followed. The girl's virginity wasn't her choice, it was a legal event. But the stratification didn't stop there. Below the oiran were yujo, lower-ranking prostitutes with fewer privileges and no right to refuse clients. Below them were streetwalkers, many of whom operated illegally and were routinely rounded up by police. In fact, the shogunate kept meticulous records of arrests, fines, and even repeat offenders. In some areas, women caught practicing sex work outside the licensed zones could be publicly humiliated, tattooed or exiled. The goal wasn't to end prostitution, it was to keep it predictable. The state wasn't interested in your desire, it was interested in order. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Male prostitutes were also part of this system, particularly in kabuki theatre, where young male actors called wakashu were sometimes available to patrons, male and female. This too was regulated. The shogunate issued edicts on how these performers could dress, interact with clients, and even how much skin they could show in public. Certain hairstyles were restricted to signal sexual availability. This wasn't underground behaviour, it was coded and legal, as long as everyone followed the rules. And of course, Japan's deeply hierarchical society ensured that sex laws were enforced differently depending on your class. A nobleman caught with an illegal mistress, quietly fined. A peasant woman found working outside the pleasure quarters, public shame and permanent exile from the district. The codes were the same on paper, but the consequences were very much on a sliding scale. One of the more haunting aspects of the system was the legal obligation of inheritance. If a woman died in debt to her brothel, her younger sister or daughter could be legally obligated to take her place. Brothel owners would document this like any other business succession. Families desperate for survival often complied, trading one generation's freedom to buy a few years of food or protection. This wasn't framed as enslavement, it was just the way things worked. The law didn't intervene. In fact, the law helped write the contract. And yet within these tight, brutal confines, courtesans became cultural legends. Some oiran held immense soft power. They influenced fashion, poetry, and even political gossip. A few used their positions to negotiate early retirement, establish their own tea houses, or arranged marriages to wealthy samurai. These cases were rare, but legally recognised. The codes allowed for upward mobility, just enough to keep the illusion alive. Now imagine it, a rainy night in Edo, lanterns glowing amber against wet stone. Inside the brothel, the oiran sits behind a silk screen, dressed in 17 pounds of embroidered kimono. Her face is painted with exquisite precision, her hair lacquered like armour. She greets her client not with a kiss, but with a poem. He responds with a riddle. If he answers wrong, he may be turned away. The contract has been signed, the tax registered, the tea has been poured, and still she has the power to refuse, legally, socially, silently. But that power has limits. Beyond the gate, her name is recorded in ledgers, her movements watched, her fate woven into bureaucracy, her body a commodity, tracked as closely as rice or silk. So yes, in Tokugawa Japan, sex wasn't just personal, it was classified, ranked and licensed. The state didn't criminalise desire, it managed it, like a crop or a festival, channeling passion into profit and rebellion into ritual. The courtesans danced in gilded cages, draped in beauty, wrapped in law, and they never missed a step. Tonight we move from the veiled elegance of Edo courtesans to a harsher, more austere tradition, one that turned abstinence into legend and grief into law. We're heading to the rugged, mountainous landscapes of Joseon-era Korea, where virtue wasn't just a personal choice, it was a legal obligation. Here, a widow could earn a place in history, not for her achievements, not for her wealth, but for one very specific thing: never remarrying. This is the story of Korea's chaste women monuments, stone pillars erected by the state to honour widows who remain celibate for life. Yes, you heard that right. State-sponsored virginity trophies. Let's set the stage. The Joseon dynasty ruled Korea from 1392 to 1897. It was a Confucian state to its bones, deeply patriarchal, bureaucratically rigid, and obsessed with moral order. The government was built on Neo-Confucian ideals, which emphasised harmony through hierarchy, ruler over subject, father over son, husband over wife, and the way a woman demonstrated her moral worth. By embodying the three obediences, to her father before marriage, to her husband during marriage, and to her husband's memory after death. Yes, even posthumously obedience was enforced. The law didn't technically forbid widows from remarrying, but it heavily discouraged it, especially among the upper classes. A woman who remarried might lose her family's standing, her dowry, and in some cases even custody of her children. But a woman who remained loyal to her dead husband, now that could earn her immortality. How? With a Yolnyeo Jongnyeobi, a chaste woman's stele, a carved stone monument erected near her home by order of the government, publicly declaring her virtue. Think of it as the world's most judgmental LinkedIn profile, visible to your entire village forever. To qualify, the widow had to prove her chastity through decades of documented abstinence, confirmed by family, neighbours and local officials. No affairs, no secret lovers, no whisper of scandal. Some were widowed as teenagers and lived into their 80s under these conditions, their entire adult lives shaped by a vow made for them before they could vote, drink, or even fully comprehend marriage. Once the petition was accepted, the Ministry of Rights approved the stele, a calligrapher inscribed the tribute, and the stone was placed like a moral lighthouse, warning every young girl who passed by. This is what the law respects. And yes, there were thousands of these monuments. Over 3,000 were documented by the end of the dynasty, each one its own little sermon in stone. Some praised the widow's unwavering loyalty or steely will. Others took a darker turn, mentioning how she refused food for 3 days or slept on cold floors as signs of her devotion. The implication? Grief wasn't enough. You had to embody your sorrow physically, preferably in a way that impressed your neighbours. Here's your fringe fact. Some women were honoured after dying by suicide following their husband's death. This was seen in some circles as the ultimate act of loyalty, sacrificing one's life to join a dead husband in the afterworld. While not universally encouraged, these suicides were sometimes praised in official documents and memorialised alongside the stela. Not only was her name cleared of sin, but her descendants might receive tax exemptions, academic privileges, or preferential treatment in government exams. The ultimate irony? Killing yourself for love could boost your kids' SAT scores. Of course, not all women submitted quietly. Some remarried in secret, others fled their villages, changed their names, or simply endured shame for the rest of their lives. Among the peasantry, where survival trumped ideology, remarriage was far more common and necessary. But among the Yangban, Korea's scholar noble class, the rules were ferocious. A remarried noblewoman could ruin a man's career just by association. And if a young woman was widowed without producing a son, her life became a quiet exile, useless in a society that only valued her womb. And yes, the law evolved, kind of. In 1447, King Seijo issued a decree that discouraged families from pushing widows into suicide. Too many women, he observed, were dying from social pressure, and the state needed more people alive than dead. But the Yolnyeyo system stayed. The government kept building monuments. Families kept submitting applications. Women kept disappearing behind layers of expectation and granite. What makes this even more complicated is that many of the widows weren't grieving romantic losses. Most Joseon marriages were arranged, with girls often wed by age 13 or 14 to men they barely knew. Their loyalty wasn't to love, it was to social survival, to their in-laws, and to the law. After the husband's death, a widow would often continue living with her husband's family, serving her mother-in-law like a servant. She had no legal right to the estate, no say in household matters, and no freedom to leave. Her chastity became her one legal asset, the only thing that could give her future generations a fighting chance. Now imagine it. A small village nestled against the green hills of Gyeongsang. A stone pillar stands near the well. Its inscription is fading, but the story is known. A woman, widowed at 17, never spoke to another man for 60 years. She raised her children alone, never left her husband's house, never looked up from her weaving frame. When she died, the government sent a scribe. Her story was recorded. The stele was carved, and every morning young girls passed it on the way to the market, reminded of what the law considered greatness. Of course, all of this eventually cracked. By the late 19th century, under pressure from modernisation and foreign influence, Korea began to question these practices. The stele system was officially abolished in the early 1900s, but thousands of those stones remain, some toppled, some preserved, many simply forgotten in fields and forest edges. Silent, stoic reminders of a time when sex laws weren't about what you did, but what you didn't. So yes, in Joseon Korea, virtue was legal, public, and built to last. Your body didn't belong to you. It belonged to your dead husband, your family, your children, and the state. And if you played your part perfectly, never touching and never wanting, you might just get a rock with your name on it. Tonight we open the heavy doors of ancient libraries, light a lantern by the inkwell, and settle into the world of the Islamic Golden Age, a period from the 8th to the 14th century when cities like Baghdad, Cairo and Cordoba glittered with knowledge, trade and, yes, surprisingly sophisticated and sometimes contradictory laws about sex. This wasn't a single empire or a monolith. It was a patchwork of caliphates, courts and cultures, all interpreting the same foundational text, the Quran, through different lenses of jurisprudence, local tradition, and let's be honest, a little personal bias. The result? A legal landscape that was part piety, part loophole, and part poetry. Let's start with the basics. Islamic law, Sharia, is drawn from the Quran, the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, Hadith, and centuries of scholarly interpretation. In this world, sex was considered a divine gift, a source of pleasure, procreation, and spiritual connection. Unlike some religious traditions that viewed sex with suspicion, Islam didn't frame intimacy as sinful by nature. In fact, within marriage, sex was encouraged, sometimes even required. One hadith says, "Your wife has rights over you, which includes sexual fulfillment." Denying your spouse intimacy without cause, that could get you taken to court. But of course, this came with a framework of laws. The most critical distinction: inside marriage is lawful, outside marriage is big trouble. Adultery, zina, was not just a moral failing, it was a criminal offence with stiff penalties. In theory, convicted adulterers could be stoned to death. In practice, that rarely happened, because the evidentiary standard was deliberately insane. You needed 4 adult male eyewitnesses to the exact act of penetration. Not just being alone together, not kissing, the actual deed. Unless you were doing it in front of a panel of extremely nosy scholars, you were probably safe from corporal punishment. But don't get too comfy. Social consequences could still be brutal. And here's your fringe fact. In the Abbasid period, some judges developed a category called zan, suspicion. If a woman was found alone with a man, and her behaviour seemed improper, she could be punished not for the act itself, but for potential immorality. The actual legal outcome varied wildly. In more conservative cities, this could lead to flogging. In liberal centres like Cordoba or Basra, it might just mean a warning, or a long letter from your uncle. But the law wasn't all fire and brimstone. It also protected women's sexual rights. A woman could seek divorce if her husband failed to satisfy her, a legitimate complaint in some schools of law. There were even jurists who discussed frequency. One said a husband should sleep with his wife every 4 nights if he had multiple wives. Another opined that a merchant should make love once a week, a labourer twice, and a man with no job every night. Islamic law, folks, now with a romantic schedule and vocational libido charts. Then there's muta, or temporary marriage, a legal loophole with centuries of controversy. Mostly recognised in Shia Islam, muta allows a man and woman to agree to a marriage for a specific period, from an hour to several years, with mutually agreed terms including a set bride price. Critics call it legalised prostitution. Defenders call it a spiritual and lawful union. The debate still going. But during the Islamic Golden Age, mut'ah was widely practised in cities like Kufa and Qom. Imagine going to the market buying a melon and also arranging a 4-day marriage while you're there. That's a legal multitask. And we haven't even gotten to the literature. Because while the courts were debating modesty and consent, the poets and scholars were writing erotic manuals, love poetry, and medical sex guides. The 10th century Andalusian scholar Ibn Hazm penned The Ring of the Dove, a deeply romantic treatise on love, longing, and heartbreak. Further east, The Perfumed Garden and the Encyclopedia of Pleasure were full-blown sex manuals, complete with diagrams, suggested positions, and aphrodisiac recipes. These weren't fringe works. They were published, preserved, and read aloud in salons, often with scholars arguing over which position maximised both pleasure and piety. Who said jurisprudence couldn't be fun? One of the strangest scholarly debates of the time involved coitus interruptus, known as azl. Early Islamic jurists debated its legality for years. Some said it was fine with the wife's consent. Others said it was a form of depriving her of her full rights. A few argued that even thinking about withdrawal too much might be morally suspicious. Yes, people in 10th century Baghdad were literally writing court opinions about premature climax. And you thought modern law got weird? The Golden Age also wrestled with same-sex desire. The Quran clearly condemns the act of male-male sex, referencing the story of Lot. But that didn't stop the generations of poets, especially in Al-Andalus, from writing passionate odes to beautiful boys, usually cupbearers or apprentices. These poems were often coded, but not that coded. Everyone knew what was being said, and many caliphs turned a blind eye. Others didn't. In some places, homosexuality was tolerated in private as long as it wasn't flaunted. In others, it was punishable by flogging or exile. Again, it depended on the city, the ruler, and whether or not the poet owed the judge a favour. Women too explored same-sex desire in literature, though much less openly. A few erotic manuals include tales of female lovers, and some Sufi mystics describe spiritual unions between women as metaphors for divine love. It's hard to know how much of this was metaphor, how much was real, and how much was a bored scribe projecting. But the law generally remained silent on female-female relationships, treating them as invisible or irrelevant. Now imagine it. The lamplit study of a Qadi in Cairo. He's been asked to rule on a case involving a merchant, his second wife, and an unpaid bride price from a mut'ah contract. The Qadi flips through legal commentaries, fingers ink-stained. Outside, the street echoes with laughter from the tea-house, where a storyteller recites an old love poem about 2 men in Cordoba. The poet knew the risk, so did the lovers, but the words still spill like honey. Because in the Islamic Golden Age, sex wasn't hidden. It was regulated, debated, and yes, celebrated, within bounds that were both sacred and bendable. It lived in court records and garden verse, in theology and cosmetics manuals. The law tried to contain it. The scholars tried to understand it. And everyone else, they just tried to enjoy it, without getting called in front of a Qadi. And now, for our final stop, we descend into the flickering candlelit corridors of medieval Europe, where heavy-lidded saints stared down from cathedral walls and peasants whispered about lust in the shadows. Here, in the lands of kings and bishops, you find a sex law system that was equal parts obsession, repression and contradiction, with the medieval church frantically trying to legislate your every desire, while the people found increasingly creative ways to ignore it. If you ever wondered what happened when theology tried to micromanage the bedroom, this is where the sermon hits the sheets. The church's stance on sex during the Middle Ages was complicated. It began with an idea that sex was a necessary evil, tolerated only for procreation and best done as quickly and emotionlessly as possible. Pleasure? Suspicious. Kissing during sex? Forbidden. Sex on Sundays? Absolutely not. And on feast days, don't even think about it. That left you with a roughly 100-day sexual calendar blackout per year, which made having a large family both difficult and ironically holy. And it wasn't just about when, it was about how. The medieval church went so far as to write penitentials, handbooks for confessors that listed, in frankly disturbing detail, every possible sex act, its sinful rating and the corresponding punishment. Missionary position within marriage? Technically allowed, but you still had to confess. Oral sex, mortal sin, rear entry, Satan's favourite pastime. Anything involving hands? Don't even. The more creative you were, the worse the penance. Some books advise 10 years of fasting for certain acts, which feels extreme until you realise people were doing these things all the time, hence the need for the list. Here's the deeply ironic twist. While the church condemned virtually every form of sexual expression, it also documented them obsessively. Monks spent years writing down cases of sexual sin, from incest to bestiality to fornication with unusual implements. If it could be imagined, it was written down. If it was written down, it was regulated. And if it was regulated, it meant people were definitely doing it. In fact, one of the most famous texts from the era, the Book of Gomorrah by Peter Damian, was meant as a moral warning, but reads like a medieval kink manual with footnotes. But let's get into the legal meat of it. The church's power over sex came from canon law, a legal system separate from civil law, enforced by clergy and built on scripture, papal decrees, and centuries of theological wrangling. Under canon law, marriage was a sacrament, meaning it couldn't be undone once consummated. That's why proving consummation was such a big deal in annulment cases. Some courts even accepted bedsheet evidence or testimony from household staff who allegedly heard the couple making joy. Other times, officials demanded medical exams, and in one particularly absurd case, a man had to demonstrate an erection in front of witnesses to prove he could consummate the union. Let's all take a moment of silence for medieval masculinity. Now for the truly unbelievable part, trial by intercourse. In rare cases involving disputed impotence, the church allowed for what was known as a copulation test. This involved an official observer, usually a priest or midwife, supervising the couple as they attempted to have sex. If they couldn't, the marriage could be annulled. If they could, congratulations. Your spiritual lives were now permanently linked and awkwardly documented. It was the world's worst honeymoon, and possibly the origin of performance anxiety. Adultery, meanwhile, was a sin and a crime, especially for women. A man could be forgiven, a woman, publicly shamed, beaten, or sent to a nunnery. Some towns even employed morality watchmen, tasked with patrolling streets for signs of sexual impropriety. If you were found alone with someone not your spouse, you could be fined, or worse, paraded through town wearing a donkey mask, which was somehow the medieval equivalent of a scarlet letter and a bad Halloween costume combined. But here's your fringe fact. In some regions, particularly in France and Italy, the church didn't just punish sin, it also regulated sex work. That's right. In cities like Avignon and Florence, brothels were taxed, sex workers were registered, and church officials set the operating hours. One bishop even wrote a guide on where to position brothels so as not to offend the eyes of the righteous. Because nothing says divine mercy like zoning laws for lust. Meanwhile, peasants were figuring out ways to navigate these laws with a level of creativity that deserves its own Bible chapter. Couples arranged hand-fasting ceremonies, informal, often secret marriages that weren't technically recognised but gave them plausible deniability. Others claimed spiritual marriage, arguing that they were joined in the eyes of God, even if no priest had signed off. Some widows simply lived with lovers and dared the village priest to make a fuss. The laws were strict, but enforcement wildly inconsistent. Even the clergy themselves weren't immune. Despite vows of chastity, records abound of monks keeping mistresses, nuns bearing children, and bishops fathering entire football teams' worth of illegitimate offspring. The church condemned it all, and then charged hefty penance fees to sweep it under the altar rug. It was less about purity and more about control. Keep the rules in place and make sure the consequences cost enough to fund a new chapel roof. Now imagine it. A cold stone confessional in a village church. A young woman kneels, her voice trembling. She's committed the sin of lust, twice and with the same stable boy. The priest opens his penitential, flips past the bestiality section, and finds her entry. 6 months of fasting, no meat, no wine, daily prayer, but if her family donates a goat to the parish, 3 months off. The Lord works in mysterious and frankly transactional ways. So yes, the medieval church tried to legislate sexuality with holy fury and obsessive precision. It banned joy, taxed brothels, regulated moaning, and held entire trials about erections. And yet, despite all the warnings, parchments, and punishments, people kept doing what people do. They loved, lusted, sinned, lied, confessed, and laughed. Because no matter how much you legislate the body, the heart, and other organs, tend to ignore the fine print. Hey guys, tonight we're wrapping up our whirlwind tour of some of the most unbelievable sex laws in ancient civilizations. You probably won't survive this journey without your jaw dropping a few times, but that's exactly why we do it, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you watching from? What time is it in your city? Drop that in the comments. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's final story. Tonight, we land in the dawn of recorded human law, the ancient city of Babylon under the rule of Hammurabi, a man who took legal codes seriously, very seriously, and wasn't shy about putting sex under the microscope. The Code of Hammurabi, carved on stone and towering over 7 feet tall, contains more than 280 laws, many of which delve into the sticky, awkward, and absolutely fascinating realm of sexual behaviour and its consequences. One of the most shocking aspects of Hammurabi's code is its brutally pragmatic attitude towards sex and family. There are laws that regulate everything from adultery to marital duties, to sexual assault and prostitution, laying out punishments that often feel equal parts logical and barbaric. For example, if a man accuses his wife of adultery and she's found guilty, she can be drowned, a public, irreversible verdict. But if the husband's claim is false, he pays a hefty fine, justice Mesopotamian style. Yet the code also shows nuanced distinctions between social classes. If a free man sleeps with a slave woman, the punishment is lighter than if he sleeps with a free woman. That double standard echoed throughout the ancient world, but Hammurabi's code formalized it in cold stone. Slaves were property, and sex with them was often treated like damage to property rights rather than personal violation. Here's a fringe fact. The code had specific laws for prostitution, which was legal and regulated. Prostitutes had to register with city authorities and pay taxes. They were required to wear particular clothing to identify themselves, a practice that feels eerily modern. If a prostitute was found sleeping with a client without paying her dues, the authorities could impose fines or banishment. Ancient Babylon was running the first recorded sex industry with licenses and ledgers. But it wasn't all about punishment. Hammurabi's code also ensured certain protections. If a man slept with another man's wife and the husband was away, the code allowed the wife to be taken by the lover, but gave the husband the right to compensation. Yes, even then, property and alliances mattered more than personal feelings, and the law laid out how much money should be paid, showing just how monetized sex and fidelity had become. What really fascinates scholars is how Hammurabi's code walks the line between social order and private life, using sex as a tool of governance. It tells us that the ancient Babylonians didn't just care about who did what in bed, they cared about how it impacted family, inheritance, and power. Sex was a political act, and the law was a blunt instrument wielded to keep that act in line. Scholars still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Some argue that the harsh penalties were meant as deterrents rather than daily realities. Others point to legal records showing frequent court cases about sexual misconduct, suggesting a legal culture highly attuned to these matters. And of course there's this question of how women experience this system, whether as protectors of family honour or as pawns in a patriarchal structure. Imagine this now. A busy Babylonian street, the scent of baked bread and date syrup heavy in the air. A woman stands before the judges, accused of adultery. Her voice is steady, but the stone tablets behind the bench loom like gods. Outside, the crowd waits. Justice is swift. And beneath it all, the pulse of a civilization that used law to police not just commerce and crime, but the most intimate human acts. So after this incredible journey through time and across cultures, from Sparta's male-only parties, to the sanctified silence of Roman vestals, to the detailed Confucian sex schedules of imperial China, through the poetic complexities of India's Kama Sutra, the ritualized trials of virginity, the fiery laws of Persia, the legal poetry of Hebrew purity, the sacred contracts of Canaan, the fluid customs of the Celts, the transactional world of Viking honour, the brutal rites of the Aztecs, the family-centred norms of the Maya, the strict order of the Incas, the licentious regulations of Japan, the moral rigidity of Joseon Korea, the multifaceted laws of the Islamic Golden Age, and finally, to the obsessive church laws of medieval Europe, we see a remarkable truth. Sex throughout history has never been just personal. It's always political, legal, and cultural. It's a mirror reflecting power dynamics, religious beliefs, social structures, and human fears. Laws about sex tell us less about what people did in bed and more about what societies wanted to control, protect, or punish. So the next time you hear someone say sex laws, those are modern problems, you can gently remind them, humanity's been tangled in love, lust, law, and loopholes that since we first carved rules into stone. Thanks for sticking with me on this wild ride. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. What ancient law shocked you the most? Where should we explore next? Drop your ideas below. Sweet dreams, and may your nights be legally uncomplicated.